I've got with me a very special guest who really, needs no introduction, but nevertheless, it's Scott Ritter. He's a former UN weapons inspector, Marine Corps intelligence officer, and he's also a brilliant military analyst. How are you, Scott? How are you doing?
I'm doing fine, thanks. How are you?
I'm fine. I'm really happy to have you on, and especially, since actually the moment the invasion started, you and I were talking live about it, and now we're May 20th. So basically, almost exactly 3 months since it began. Scott, could you maybe just give us your take about everything that's happened in recent weeks and where you see the war right now? Who is winning, if that's a verb that we can even use, or shall we say whose chances look more favorable? And what do you think of what happened in Mariupol with Azov? Although, just so you know, we'll dive into more detail into those individually. But what's your general overview?
Well, I think, to be frank, this special military operations lasted about a month longer than I ever envisioned it would. I personally had anticipated that Russia would achieve its military objectives, and in doing so, its political objectives, within about a 2-month period. And we're into a third month, and while Russia is well on pace to accomplish, from a military standpoint, what it set out to do, the delay, and it's not a delay on Russia's part, because frankly speaking, Russia doesn't give a damn what I think in terms of my timeline. Russia has its own timeline, and Russia has its own plan. And I think the Russians, according to Lavrov and other Russian officials, they are on pace to accomplish every task they have set out. I don't question their ability to accomplish the military tasks that were spelled out when the special military operation began. That is, regarding the 160 to 200,000 regular Ukrainian forces, the tens of thousands of Azov and other Adar and other neo-Nazi right-wing territorial units, and hundreds of thousands of reservists. I have never doubted Russia's ability to defeat them, and Russia is defeating them as we speak. I've never doubted Russia's ability to destroy Nazi formations or to demilitarize Ukrainian forces that have been trained by NATO. And as we speak, Russia is doing just that. But the special military operation wasn't just about demilitarization and denazification. This conflict wasn't just about liberating Donbass. It wasn't just about securing water for Crimea. That's why Russia went into Kherson and expanded south. It wasn't about building a land bridge connecting Crimea to Russia. This conflict was about some political objectives. And if you've studied, great military thinkers, I think Clausewitz famously said, and I'm paraphrasing, that war is merely, politics by other means. So we can't just speak of military victories. We have to talk about the political objectives, because war isn't fought to win a battle. War is fought to achieve a political objective. In the case of Russia, the political objectives were twofold. One, to ensure that Ukraine would not join NATO in perpetuity, that it would be a permanently neutral nation. And this was connected to a larger objective of redefining and reshaping a European security framework that had NATO pulling back its military forces to 1997 boundaries. And one has to ask, when you look at the situation today in Ukraine, is Russia achieving its political objectives? I mean, let's just be honest about it. Ukraine is not neutral. Ukraine is, in fact, more NATO today than they have ever been in their entire existence. And NATO is not folding like a house of cards. NATO is doubling down on reinforcing its frontiers, bringing forces toward the Russian border, not away from the Russian border. And the eastward expansion of NATO that Russia said, we don't want to have anything to do with. It's a red line for us. I don't know what you call Finland and Sweden seeking to join NATO other than the eastward expansion of NATO up to Russia's borders. I mean, they're going to have a new, very long border with Russia if Finland and Sweden, in fact, join. So while this doesn't mean that is the final outcome. I mean, look, Europe's got a lot of problems. It's one thing to talk about deploying troops to the NATO's frontier. It's another thing to actually pay for it and make it happen. And we don't know if NATO is going to be able to do that. Europe right now is undergoing a economic shock that could get much worse than it already is.
Yeah.
And it's difficult to see how they can fund, for instance, a $210 billion plan to de-link themselves from Russian energy, which the European, I think, Commission or Council just talked about. It's a plan, by the way. It's full of theory and stuff, nice graphics, but it hasn't been implemented. Just like their military plans, lots of theory and graphics and arrows and such, but nothing permanent has happened. How do you afford this? I don't know if Europe can afford this. I don't know if NATO is going to survive. People say, oh, it's expanding. Really, has it expanded yet? Because Turkey has sort of put a marker on the table saying, we're not happy. It's not about the expansion, but about who they're expanding with. Turkey's very unhappy about the pro-Kurdish stance taken by Sweden and indirectly Finland. Croatia's not happy. They're like, hey, we've got this big problem in the Balkans still. It's called Serbia, Kosovo, and we might want to settle the Balkans first before we go off and create a new adventure in the north. So, just because Russia hasn't accomplished its objectives yet doesn't mean that Russia will never accomplish its objectives. But the point is, there is now a widening gap between Russia's military objectives, which they are accomplishing, and their political objectives, which in many ways seem to be further away from Russia's grasp than they were when this conflict actually started. And then we have other problems. What does denazification mean? I mean, it looks like Russia's been very successful at denazifying the Azov regiment that was in Mariupol. Thousands have surrendered, thousands were killed. That's pretty good denazification. But the last time I checked, there was Azovstal in Kharkov. The Kraken battalion of the Azov regiment is operating there. There's Azov in Kiev. There's Aidar fighting on the front lines. There's other Svoboda and right sector units fighting on the front lines, dug in Western Ukraine. And also, last time I checked, there's still a statue of Stepan Bandera in Lvov, and he's still the national hero of Ukraine. So as long as all of that exists, you can't speak of denazification. If anything, Ukraine's become Nazified. And what I mean by that is Zelensky, the wonderful Jewish president who would never align himself with Nazis, according to the West, has outlawed every political party except the Nazis. Svoboda, the right sector, they're there. They're surrounding him. Ukraine has become a de facto Nazi state. And how do you denazify that? Russia needs to, if they want to accomplish that mission, they need to have a plan for that. I don't see that plan right now because 200,000 troops may be sufficient to accomplish militarily what they set out to do under the special military operation. But I don't think 200,000 troops allows you to capture Western Ukraine, Lvov, seize Kiev, and all that. So that's a problem. And demilitarization. There's no doubt that Russia's kicking butt, I'll say, on the front lines. They are fighting this war at a pace that enables them to slaughter Ukrainians at minimal cost to them. every advantage is accrued by the Russians. They control the skies, they control the drones, they control the artillery, they control the targeting, and the Ukrainians are literally getting blown apart. Piecemeal, day by day, the Russians just grind them out. Sometimes Ukrainians strike back. I'm never going to denigrate the courage of the Ukrainian soldier or the professionalism of the Ukrainian soldier. And the fact is, if Russia makes a mistake, Russia pays. That's called war. And Russia is paying. It's not the heaviest price in the world, but to pretend that Russia's not suffering any casualties in this phase of the conflict is absurd in the extreme. But despite the fact that Russia's grinding them down, there's a new reality that didn't exist when this war started. When this war started, the West was providing Ukraine with hundreds of millions of dollars of light weaponry, Javelin missiles, in-laws. The Germans provided the Panzerfaust, some Stingers and such. The West was afraid to provide heavy weapons. They were concerned that this would be misconstrued as somehow interfering in the special military operation and bring the wrath of Russia down on them. But ever since the transition from phase one operations to phase two, meaning the Russian withdrawal from Kiev and reconfiguration of forces against the Donbass, the West has become quite bold. And right now, the president of the United States, Joe Biden, has just signed a $40 billion military aid package. And when you combine that with all the other aid, that's $53 billion that have been provided in the first 4 months of this year. Now, let's just let that number sink in for a second, because that exceeds the total military budget for the Russian military in 1 year. And that Russian military budget funds submarines, capital ships, ICBMs, airplanes, and the army. So we've given Ukraine in 4 months more money than Russia spends on its whole military in 1 year.
Right.
And then we've also opened up this concept of Lend-Lease. And the amount of money that can be provided through Lend-Lease has no limit, literally. So this changes things, because it's not just the equipment coming in, because early on, when they started the provision of the heavy equipment, it was a panicked affair, because suddenly the West said, oh my goodness, if we don't replace this equipment that's being destroyed, Ukraine will have nothing. And so it was a panicked affair. They quickly grabbed old armored vehicles, old artillery pieces, and they started jamming them through. And it was sort of a tragic joke, because Ukraine didn't have the ability to maintain this equipment. They didn't know how to operate it properly. And pretty much it was a death sentence. But Ukraine seems to have embraced the notion of sacrificing life for time. Because now what's happened, because they have put these units on the front line, they have been sacrificed, they've bought time. And Ukraine has now been afforded strategic depth that they didn't have at the beginning of this war. Ukrainian forces right now are in Germany, Poland, and I believe in Romania, being trained by NATO on advanced weapon systems. And this isn't panicked, haphazard training. For instance, to be trained on the new German-provided self-propelled artillery system, the Ukrainian troops, it's a 40-day course, 40 days. That means that Ukraine doesn't envision surrendering anytime soon. Ukraine now has a long-term plan to reconstitute its military, bring them into Ukraine, and continue the fight. So how can you speak of demilitarization when for every unit you're destroying on the front line, NATO is helping Ukraine reconstitute a better unit in German soil or Polish soil? And then they're bringing that in. And that's another frustrating aspect. One would think that the Russians would have figured out how to interdict more effectively the arms coming across. And there is some success. We see the missiles hit the warehouses, et cetera. But we also see the artillery pieces show up on the front lines. We see the Polish tanks show up on the front lines. That means they're getting through. I think last time we talked, we spoke about the fuel problem, the fuel crisis that Ukraine was having, because the Russians were blowing up all their refineries and their fuel storage. And I've made some glib comments about, what do you call a Ukrainian tank that's out of gas? A coffin, because it can't move, therefore it dies. But the Ukrainian tanks are moving. Why? Because Poland and Europe are providing them with refined petroleum products. Hundreds, if not thousands, of rail cars full of oil, gasoline, diesel, are making their way into Ukraine to be used by the Ukrainian military. So, the game has changed. That doesn't mean Russia's losing. If you start the Super Bowl with Tom Brady and he gets injured in the third quarter and you replace him with the backup quarterback, the game just changed. It doesn't mean you're going to lose. It just means that it's now a whole different game. It's a whole different game plan. And by allowing Ukraine the strategic depth, and by Ukraine now looking long-term in terms of the preparation of military forces, the game has changed. And almost exclusively on the Ukrainian side. Russia, meanwhile, still has the same 200,000 troops that it started with and the same limited objectives. So, I sit here 3 months into the conflict and I have to wonder, how long is this going to go on? Time is not the friend of Russia. Now, there'll be some people that say, well, maybe it is. Maybe they'll bleed Ukraine white. Maybe the wives and the sisters and the mothers will rise up after seeing their men slaughtered and bring down the government. Well, if that's your plan, I'd fire you as a general, because I don't think you can point too many times in history where the women have successfully stopped a major war because their men are dying. It just doesn't work that way. Generally what happens is countries double down when they take great casualties, and Ukraine appears to be doubling down. Whether this is sustainable, we don't know. But what we do know is that Ukraine at least is not just talking the talk, but walking the walk in terms of a long, drawn-out conflict. Russia is too, but Russia hasn't changed anything. Russia's still doing what it's started out to do. And I think, look, we see right now on the battlefield, Russia is surrounding thousands of troops, not just in Mariupol. I'm talking about in Severodonetsk and other areas. The pincers are closing in. Some reports say that the Ukrainian defense minister is begging Zelensky to allow 8,000 troops to retreat from Severodonetsk so they don't get surrounded, so they can be pulled back and put into the fight elsewhere. And this is happening throughout. So Russia is winning the tactical battles. Russia is winning the operational maneuvering. But you don't win a war just by winning battles. You have to accomplish your political objectives. And the real danger here is that by failing to accomplish their strategic political objectives, Russia is losing by not winning. And Ukraine is winning by not losing. And, I think that's where we are 3 months into this conflict. I thought it would have been a much more cut and dried Russian victory by this point in time. It doesn't mean Russia's failing, but it doesn't mean Russia's achieving the strategic objectives that they set out to do.
Well, you laid it out quite well, and I'm going to ask you some more specific questions, Scott. But just before I proceed, I see we've got close to 5,000 people watching, so please make sure you guys have hit the like button. It helps the channel grow and to fight the algorithm. So, Scott, just you mentioned Mariupol a couple of times. The situation right now. This is May 20th. They're saying that the Russians are claiming that they've captured around 1,700 troops, right? So this is from Reuters, right? 1,730 troops, according to the Russians. And there are also reports that there are still Azov battalion inside the steel plant. So it's not inside the steelworks. So it's not exactly over. Do you think that this spells the end of Azov? And I ask this rhetorically because you kind of hinted that they're present elsewhere. And it's not just them. People talk about Azov mostly, but you have other far-right elements, as they like to call them. What do you think of the situation there in the steelworks and what it represents?
Well, first of all, this battle in terms of its ability to impact the military outcome on the front has been over for some time. You cannot have a meaningful impact on the Eastern Front while you're hundreds of meters underground beneath the Azovstal factory. There's a political aspect to this. The Ukrainian government, in close concert with the Western media, has painted the defenders of the Azovstal plant as sort of the modern day. It's a modern day Stalingrad. These are the heroic defenders of Ukraine who are pinning down thousands of Russian troops. Well, no, not really. I think the majority of Russia's assault troops were actually released from the battlefield a long time ago and have made their way to the front line. The troops that remain are sufficient to the task, which is to keep Azov pinned in, no one escapes, and then every day it's getting hit. And the Russians have figured it out. I mean, and you hear this from some of the Azov guys who've surrendered. They find a spot and they hit it 3 times in a row with their 2,000, 3,000 pound bombs. First time opens up the soil. The second time fractures the concrete. The third time collapses it, and whoever's underneath it is dead. That's the reality. And that's the future of anybody who stays in Azovstal plant. But right now, the people that still remain are apparently the commander of Azov and his senior leadership, and probably some of the more brutal Nazi thugs. They had hoped that they would have been evacuated, that that the Russians would have put them on a bus and sent them to Ukrainian-controlled territory. Now, the Russians have behaved very properly. There's been no torture. There's been no beatings. There's been no executions. The wounded are getting the exact same treatment in Russian medical facilities as wounded Russian soldiers. Russia's doing everything properly by the book, including segregating legitimate Ukrainian soldiers who are being processed as prisoners of war from Azov Nazi thugs who are being processed as criminal suspects. And the Azov Nazi thugs will all be put on trial. That's just the way it is. And the Nazi leadership underground is looking at this saying, I don't know if I want to go on trial because I know I'm guilty as hell. I know what I've done, and I know that the Russians know what I've done. And so if I surrender, that's my future. And, people always hope. I'm pretty sure the defenders of the Alamo were hoping until the last second that somehow they would push back Santa Anna's Mexican assault troops, that maybe Sam Houston and the Texas Army would come over the horizon and save them. And they held on to that belief until the last Mexican bayonet penetrated their chest. And I'm fairly certain that the defenders of Azovstal are down there hoping there will be some outcome other than they're dying or they're being taken captive by the Russians and being subjected to a trial, which the outcome is a foregone conclusion because of the absolute certainty of their guilt. So I think we have an ongoing propaganda going on. It's a fight between the Ukrainians trying to portray Mariupol as this brave Thermopylae type defense, and the Russians trying to portray this as denazification, that they have cleansed the den of the beast. And I think on this one, time is actually on Russia's side because even the West is starting to wake up to the reality of many of the people they've taken prisoner. I mean, you can't disguise it when the Russians say, take off your shirt, and you got the Nazi swastika staring you right in the face. Then it's there. And as the Russians are starting to show the prisoners and comparing them with the videos that these people made back when they were good citizen Nazis, the ones holding the Nazi flag, doing the stiff arm salute and all that, you can't escape that. You can't say, oh, we've exaggerated the Nazis. I think the Russians are on the verge of being able to settle this question once and for all. Whether or not the West will buy this message, embrace this message is another question, but I think Russia's going to win the propaganda aspect of Mariupol. But for a long time, it dominated the news. And I mean, you could still turn on CNN right now and hear the anchors praise the brave defenders of Mariupol. Never once have they said, these are some of the most rancid human beings ever, who raped women, murdered children, carried out horrific acts of brutality against unarmed, innocent civilians, which is the truth of Azov, which is the absolute truth of Azov. That's all they've ever been. They've never been the brave defenders. They've only been the brutal oppressors. And, we'll see.
Yeah, the whole Nazi thing is quite bizarre. On Victory Europe Day, so that's known as VE Day, 8th of May, defeat of Nazism, defeat of fascism in Europe, 1945. This is obviously a national holiday. It's a celebration in the Allied in the Allied countries. And this year was very weird, because we saw, for example, the Russian ambassador to Poland at the Soviet cemetery. They threw red paint in his face. I saw multiple videos from various pundits, officials. I think even Zelensky himself, saying that what Russia was doing now in Ukraine was like the Nazis. What did you make of that? Because my grandfather fought against the Nazis in World War II. He was Royal Air Force. We all know that the British, the Soviets, the Americans fought the Nazis, and now they're basically accusing the Soviets of being Nazis, the Russians of being Nazis, and downplaying the Soviet sacrifices. So 27 million Soviets killed, and also the majority of German casualties inflicted by the Soviets. What did you make of this year?
Well, what I'll note is, we'll start off just by noting the obvious. How big was the VE Day parade in London this year?
Well, I wasn't watching it, but exactly.
They didn't have one. How big was the VE Day parade in Washington, D.C.? They didn't have one either. There was no VE Day parade anywhere in Europe on May 8th. On May 9th, there was a Victory Day parade in Moscow.
Right.
There's a Victory Day parade in every major Russian city and town throughout the entire Russian Federation. And it's not a holiday that people, look, I used to be a volunteer firefighter here in Del Mar, and every Memorial Day, we have the Memorial Day parade, and everybody comes out. It's sort of a, hey, we'll wave the flag, we'll applaud the volunteer firefighters as they come by and all that stuff. But it was more of a social event, as opposed to actually memorializing what it's supposed to, which is fallen heroes. May 9th is it's the most serious holiday in Russia. There's nothing more serious than May 9th. Mm-hmm. Because Russia lost between 27 and 32 million people in that war. The Soviet Union sacrificed everything, put it all on the line, not just for Soviet Union, but for all of humanity. Because if it weren't for the Soviet sacrifice, Nazi Germany would not have been defeated, at least not on the timetable that they were defeated on. It would have been a much more difficult proposition for the United States and Great Britain and the other Allied countries to retake Europe from a Nazi Germany that didn't have 66% of its forces arrayed against the Soviet Union. There's something called the Immortal Regiment. These are the family members. These are the sons, the daughters, increasingly now the grandsons and granddaughters of the men and women who fought in that conflict, many of whom died in that conflict. And because they can't march anymore, because it used to be the veterans would march.
Yep.
Hardly any veterans alive today, and those who are alive can't march too well. So the families march in their stead. They hold photographs of the family members. And over 1 million Russians participated in the Immortal Regiment March in Moscow. In every major city throughout Russia, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Russian citizens participated in the Immortal Regiment. This resonates. This is real. And one of the reasons it's real is because of what Nazi Germany did to the Soviet Union, the sacrifices that were made. And so while the West is trying to score cheap political points, and Zelensky is he just debases himself when he says things such as Russia is the new Nazi Germany. I mean, Zelensky is the new Nazi Germany. I mean, Zelensky is a man who has empowered the same ideology that was embraced by Hitler's Third Reich. Stepan Bandera. People forget that Bandera, the great Ukrainian nationalist, is the man who controlled the Western Ukrainians wearing Nazi uniforms who pulled the triggers that killed 30,000 Jews at Babi Yar.
Yep.
That these Western Ukrainians wearing Nazi uniforms manned the death camps, manned the death squads, hunted down Jews, hunted down Poles, hunted down Russians, hunted down Ukrainians, slaughtered them by the hundreds of thousands. That's what Stepan Bandera is. And yet now he's a national hero, and Zelensky has the gall to call the Russians the new Nazis. Zelensky needs to understand that there's a reason why Vladimir Putin is more popular today than he has been at any time, especially since the special military operation. And it's not because the Russians really dig invading Ukraine. They don't. If you ask a Russian straight to their face, most Russians will say, I wish we hadn't done this. I wish we hadn't gone to war against Ukraine. But the more Zelensky acts out, more Zelensky aligns himself with the Nazis, the more he guarantees his ultimate demise, because he is now becoming the new face of neo-Nazi ideology, not because he himself believes in the same, how could he? He's a Jew. How can a Jewish president embrace the ideology that views Jews as subhumans? Does he not listen to the men who work for him? Does he not see the videos where they mock Jews, where they talk about killing Jews? Why does he ignore this? I'll tell you why. You know, in every concentration camp that killed Jews, you had Jewish facilitators. They were called capos. Zelensky is the modern day capo. He thinks he's in charge. He's in charge of nothing. Zelensky would not be in the seat that he enjoys unless the Nazis wanted him to be in that seat. He exists because he is doing the bidding of the Nazis. And how can you say otherwise? They're the only political parties allowed to exist today in Ukraine. He's outlawed every other party. There's the only ideology that is allowed to be espoused today.
Well, for me, what was really weird is that on Victory Europe Day, his social media team, I'm guessing it's his social media team, they posted this picture on Instagram and Telegram with a Ukrainian soldier with an SS Death's Head at Totenkopf. I mean, when I saw that, that was actually the first time I saw something that's like, this has to be Russian propaganda. Like, this can't be real. This is a parody. Why would you post something like that? And on VE Day, this cannot be real. I swear to God, for about 2 days, I just wouldn't believe it. And then I finally found the link of the forwarded post. And on Telegram, you can't change the forwarded post stays the same, even if the original's edited. Oh boy, it's there. It's real. And it's beyond parody. It's beyond parody. I don't even know what to say to that.
Well,
I really don't.
It's the same thing. Even before this conflict started, there was a U.S. Air Force colonel, a female, Brittany, and I don't know her last name, but she was the air attaché to Ukraine, and she went on this tour of the Ukrainian forces, and in uniform, she allows herself to be photographed going to a memorial to the Bandera dead. The men who died fighting for the Waffen SS during World War II. She allows herself to have Azov type patches put on her shoulder and be photographed. Now, does she know that she is allowing herself to be portrayed as being one with the Azov regiment, the Nazi ideology, or is she ignorant? Now, she's a colonel. She's a foreign area officer, which means she ostensibly has studied Ukraine, understands its history and language. And one would believe that she is cognizant of the political realities in Ukraine. So I can't think that she didn't know what she was doing. And yet somehow she allowed her willingness to buy into a Russophobic policy on the part of the United States to outweigh her embrace of an ideology that 100,000+ Americans gave their lives to defeat during the Second World War. I mean, that's the bottom line. She disgraced every single grave and every single military cemetery spread throughout Europe where American soldiers are buried, Americans who died fighting Nazi Germany. And she's in the military? So look, Zelensky's not alone for being literally brain dead when it comes to this. Look, I condemn the entire American Jewish community that fails to speak out about this. If you're an American Jew and you are not shouting from the top of your voice, why in God's name are we giving $1 single to a Ukrainian government that facilitates, sustains, and gives succor to Nazi ideology? We're paying the salaries of the Azov regiment. We're buying the weapons used by the Nazi troops in Ukraine. And people will say, well, there are not that many of them. One's too many. One is too many.
I mean,
if Ukraine is allowing a single Nazi to exist, it's at fault. And yet it's allowing tens of thousands to exist. And when you take a look at Nazi Germany, you know, the Nazi party was a minority. Not every German was a member of the Nazi party. Only a minority of them were. But the rest of the Germans made them possible by supporting their policies. So even if Ukraine is, you know, only say a couple 100,000, maybe 1 million dedicated ultranationalist neo-Nazi types, the other 39 million Ukrainians make it happen by letting it happen, by supporting it. They're all Nazis.
It's not just them. It's like you said. It's the British government. It's the U.S. government. It's all of these countries. Our governments.
The German government. The German government.
The German government. It's funny to me how they're suddenly fine with Germany rearming. You know, and the irony of it all. Where are those weapons going? Some you know, part of that whole scheme. This is really insulting.
And looking east. Looking
east. It's beyond parody, and it's really insulting. I think it's every American, every European, everyone who's a citizen or, you know, a resident should be talking about this, because it's just nuts. It's really nuts. And they try to normalize this. Like you said, you turn on CNN, they don't really tell you who are these gallant defenders. They just tell you they're honorable defenders. They don't tell you that they're Nazis, you know, and
rapists,
it's just disgusting.
Murderers, and thugs. That's what they are.
I feel like I'm in an episode of The Twilight Zone. None of this makes sense to me. It doesn't make sense. And you know, you spoke about the money that they're giving the Ukrainians. So the House voted to give Ukraine $40 billion. Were you surprised that every single House Democrat who was present voted for that, voted in favor, even the ones who are so-called anti-war, who are, you know, self-styled progressives? Why are they giving money to the CIA and, you know, the military-industrial complex and a bunch of Nazis?
Well, let's put this in a little bit broader perspective. It wasn't that long ago, I'll give you a pro hint, less than a year, that we suffered a humiliating defeat in Afghanistan. And we have a special inspector general for Afghan reconstruction who has authored several reports trying to explain how this happened. How did we spend 20 years pouring, you know, more than $100 billion worth of aid into Afghanistan only to lose? And one of the lessons learned was that literally every single general officer who testified before Congress lied. And worse, every single member of Congress knew they were lying when they were testified to, but they went ahead and supported this because they had bought into a narrative of perception changing that existed in a fantasy world, not the reality on the ground. They refused to look at the reality on the ground. They ignored the corruption. They didn't realize that when we sent money to Afghanistan, it disappeared into people's pockets. It didn't accomplish what we wanted it to accomplish, even though we had an inspector general there. And so one of the lessons learned was never again Congress will redouble its oversight. We will ensure we're told the truth by the military. We will never allow ourselves to be used again where passion overcomes reason. Less than a year later, they're passing a $40 billion spending plan without any reasoned debate, accepting at face value every single lie told to them by the military, by the government, by the Biden administration, just embracing that lie, pouring the money away. And now we know, thanks to Rand Paul, they refuse to appoint an inspector general because they don't want to know the truth. They just want to be seen for political purposes here at home as supporting the brave Ukrainian defenders against the horrible Nazi-like Russian aggressor. That's the story that's being pitched. And so politically, they're embracing that story, even though that story is so far removed from the truth that even a third grader could pierce the lies simply by asking some basic questions, which is why Congress won't allow any questions to be asked. No questions. Where are the hearings? When was the last time we gave $40 billion away without holding a hearing? We just gifted it to them. Gifted it. And we're gifting it to the single most corrupt, not the single most, but one of the most corrupt nations on the planet, one of the most corrupt nations in Europe, during a time of war where the level of corruption has gone through the roof.
Right, yeah.
So, what the heck is going on here? And as an American, you're sitting here going, I mean, look, if I were a college student, I'd say, hey, Joe, I could call you Joe, can't I? You're the president. I even voted for you, Joe. I bought into that progressive nonsense. What about student loans, Joe? What about student loans? You're sitting there considering $10,000 worth of forgiveness, but you're giving $40 billion away to the most corrupt nation on the planet. What about infrastructure, Joe? What about, damn, I'm a mom with a kid that doesn't have any baby formula, Joe.
There you go.
And yet you're giving money away without any accountability. If I sign a student loan or if I make any government application, I've got to fill out forms this thick. And then I get a phone call every 2 weeks from some government accounting person reminding me that I signed form X, Y, and Z, and that I owe this much interest and all that. And God forbid I'm 3 days late on my payment. They come at me with threats and all this stuff. We're giving $40 billion away to the most corrupt nation on the earth with no checks and balances, with no accounting. This is the definition of insanity. And every American should be incensed. They're not. They're not. The American public is just sitting there going, the only thing they're, gotta watch what I say, the only thing they're angry about is high gas prices. High gas prices. Well, you irritated me, Joe, because I'm paying $5 a gallon. Well, why? It's Putin's war. No, it's Biden's policies. It's Biden's policies that are causing this to happen. But that's the only reason why they're enraged. If the United States found a way to keep gas prices low and preferably diesel prices, because that's what's ultimately going to destroy our economy, is high diesel prices, and the cost of transportation sends the cost of everything through the roof, which is going to happen this summer. Wake up, America. Wake up, Europe. But no, that's what gets us mad. Not sending $40 billion to a Nazi regime without any accounting. It's insane. I apologize for getting active about this.
No. I can barely believe it myself. No matter how many times we look at it, I can barely believe it myself. And like you said, it's funny they didn't like this idea of Rand Paul's to have an inspector general or some sort of checks and balances. You mentioned the lend-lease before, so as the name implies, it's about lending and leasing weapons. It's not a giveaway. Obviously $40 billion is not enough. I'm sure there'll be others, but the lend-lease is about lending and leasing all sorts of weapons. And what really stuck out to me as I was reading the news about this in the mainstream media, legacy media, they explained what the lend-lease is in a sentence, and they said that this comes from World War II. There used to be a lend-lease in World War II, very famous, where the United States gave aid to the other Allied forces, and they only said British. They only said that it was to give aid to the British forces, and they left out that the Russians were also recipients of the original Lend-Lease, the second largest recipients, right? Like this is incredible to me. It's like they're trying so hard to omit or obfuscate any sort of reference to Russians, even in a good light. It's really
Right.
something.
No, it's. I mean, I wish Americans would study history. The Russians do. I'll give you a question, and I'll say, what percentage of the tanks that Russia used in the Battle of Moscow and from October to December 1941 were Lend-Lease provided?
I'm
And
gonna
most
guess.
Americans will go ahead.
I'm gonna guess maybe near half, somewhere around 50%.
It's less than 50%, but it's between 30 and 40%,
Okay.
which is a significant number. But my point is, I think most people go, tanks? Game tanks? Huh? How'd that happen? Most of the tanks were actually, at that time, were British tanks, the Valentines, the Matildas. The Sherman tank came in later in 1942. The Sherman tank, 42 and 43, the Sherman tank actually outnumbered the T-34 in many parts of the battlefield. It wasn't until later in 43, 44 that the T-34 came out in the kind of dominant numbers, the T-34, 85, and things of that nature. But the trucks that transported the Red Army were Ford trucks. The Jeep was all over the place.
Yeah.
They P-39 Air Cobras were a mainstay of the Russian Air Force. The fact is we helped the Russians, and the Russians know it, and the Russians acknowledge it. The Russians are forever grateful for the assistance provided. And yet we are erasing that part of the history as if we are somehow embarrassed that we did this. Why would we embarrass helping the nation that killed more Germans than anybody else?
Yep. Yeah, and I wanted to ask you something, Scott, about the role that the U.S. is playing in helping Ukraine, because they're trying to portray it as, it's Russia at war with Ukraine. I think right now it's become a mask-off thing, right? They're not really hiding that it's a proxy war. And what did you make of these reports in the media that the United States helped the Ukrainians to kill Russian generals? The United States helped Ukraine to sink the Russian flagship in the Black Sea, the Moskva. I mean, doesn't that seem a little escalatory, to put it mildly?
Well, I've known since the beginning that the potential for Ukraine to receive some of the top line intelligence collected by the United States and NATO was real, because one only has to take a look at the RC-135 flight profiles, the Global Hawk flight profiles, the other collection platforms. Understand, again, I don't want to do people's work for them, but it's not an impossible task to track the flight paths of America's signals intelligence and imagery satellites. The Russians are doing it. And so when you put all this stuff together, you know what these systems are capable of doing, that at a minimum, NATO is getting a very, very thorough picture of Russian capabilities and, by extension, their vulnerabilities. If I were flying a strike package for a NATO mission with an American aircraft, I would be given a strike a briefing package that would show all of the radar coverage of all the air defense, and I would plot a path through the scene that would take me around it and in it, so I wouldn't be shot down. And I would plot this path very carefully, fly it in, go under the radar here. I would know what my weapons release point would be ahead of time. I would know which way I'm going to egress to avoid detection and escape the same way, so that I can go in, bomb my target, get out, and not get shot down. Intelligence facilitates this. Ask yourself, how did Ukrainian helicopters penetrate Russian airspace about a month and a half ago and destroy a fuel site outside of Belgorod? Because Ukrainians were given the intelligence I just talked about. They were given the scene. They were shown where to fly, how to avoid air defense, because and this intelligence isn't good if it's collected last week, because the Russians aren't stupid. They move around. They don't just sit in one place. They shift their their assets on a daily basis to change things up. And so the Ukrainians were provided real-time intelligence. That means as we collect it, it's being sent to an intelligence analyst center where they put together this package, and then they send it to the Ukrainians real time. Ukrainians are getting that. How did Ukrainians sink the Moskva? More than likely, a weakness was identified by U.S. intelligence, and it was provided to the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians acted on it in real time. Generals, the U.S. or NATO is collecting information on command and control targets. It can pinpoint a senior command and control. They can give it to the Ukrainians, and if the Ukrainians have the ability to interdict, they will. There is no doubt in my mind that this is happening. There's no doubt in my mind that somewhere in Poland, there is a joint intelligence center where NATO and Ukrainians sit down together. The intelligence come into a NATO-only room or an American-only room, because sometimes we don't share stuff with the NATO allies. It's that sensitive. And then we have analysts who have been told ahead of time what they can send down. So they weed out the really sensitive stuff, but they send it down to this joint center where they work together to build different packages that are sent on to frontline units. So there's direct connectivity. You know what I call this? An act of war. It's an act of war. You are facilitating the delivery of death to Russians. Russia knows this. They're not stupid. They know this. But it's just one of the realities. If you don't think that the United States has been on the other end of that game, where nations have provided intelligence to entities that we're engaged in combat with, and that intelligence has facilitated the death of Americans, you live on a different planet. It happens. It's reality. It's big boy stuff. You put on your big boy pants and you do it. But if you noticed, very rarely do you ever get U.S. government officials to comment on intelligence issues. But notice what happened the moment somebody leaked to the press that it was U.S. intelligence that helped sink the Moscow.
They walked it back.
Presidential level. No. We're not doing that at all. That's not what we're doing. We don't want to do that. And then the real reason is we don't want to provoke Russians because, again, let's just put on your thinking hat for a second. There's a guy named Qasem Soleimani. You might remember that name. One of the most hated people, Iranians, in America. Why? Because during the American occupation of Iraq, Qasem Soleimani's Quds forces worked with Shia rebels in southern Iraq to confront the American occupier. That's from the perspective of the Iraqis and the Iranians. The Americans will say we were the brave liberators and we're being attacked by the brutal, thuggish terrorists of southern Iraq. But either way, the fighting cost America about 500 to 600 dead. And the United States blames Qasem Soleimani for facilitating the intelligence and the material support that resulted in these deaths. And we held that grudge against him all the way till the end. One of the reasons why we killed him is because we hated him. And we hated him because we blamed him for the deaths of 500 to 600 Americans. Now, as an American, I can say I understand where the hatred comes from. You kill my fellow citizens, I'm going to kill you. Big boy rules, baby. Well, okay, but we're now in the business of killing not hundreds, but thousands of Russians. And you don't think the Russians had the same anger towards us that we had towards Qasem Soleimani? You don't think the Russians have identified everybody involved in that decision chain? But the difference is, when I talk about big boy pants, the Russians know how to wear them. I mean, there's not going to be any act of revenge. They know what the game is. They're not children. See, we put on big boy pants and they fall down. We have to get suspenders to put them on because we're still childlike in our ability to interact with the rest of the world. We think we're so exceptional that we could never have a situation where people do to us what we do to them. The Russians are adults. They're not happy about this, and it will damage relations going forward. But people need to understand that we are doing to Russia what Qasem Soleimani did to us, and we didn't like it. Maybe the Russians don't like it as well. But we don't think that way. We never think about the other point of view, what other people are thinking. We're very selfish in the United States. We only think about ourselves and what matters to us. But the policymakers panicked when the media started running with that story because they, again, we don't understand Russia. We don't know Russia, especially at the policy level. So we projected onto Russia how we would react if we received information that Russia would. You remember Russia's paying the Taliban to assassinate American soldiers. I mean, it was a made-up story, but oh my God, we had people ready to go to war with Russia over this made-up story. And so we panicked because we projected onto Russia how we would feel if Russia was providing information that enabled somebody to sink an American ship or kill an American general.
Okay, well, speaking of escalation and how Russia would react, right now we have seen Finland and Sweden apply to join NATO. Now, I think it's worth saying that Finn and Swedish troops have already been trained for years for NATO interoperability. So it's not like they're just coming out of the blue to combine with NATO. Nevertheless, it is a significant move. What do you think of all that? We'll talk about Turkey's response in a second, but just the notion of these two countries joining NATO and then Finland and NATO, by extension, sharing a brand new 1,300 kilometer border with Russia. Because even if you want to say the Russians are lying about the reason going into Ukraine, ostensibly, they've said it's because of NATO expansion, and now we're seeing more NATO expansion.
Yeah. Let's just start with, again, to put things in perspective, I think we have to look at history. Both Finland and Sweden have said that the reason why they are moving to join NATO now is because of the new reality created when Russia invaded Ukraine. Okay, I get it. I mean, yeah, not a good thing. Except now I'm thinking Sweden. Sweden seemed to be okay with Nazi Germany invading everybody back in World War II, and yet they retained their neutrality. I don't recall Sweden being so outraged over the brutality of Nazi Germany that they suddenly said, hell, we're going to join the United States and Great Britain in this great crusade to free. No, Sweden retained its neutrality. It was neutral for Nazi Germany, but because Russia invaded Ukraine to protect the rights of Russian citizens in the Donbass who were being slaughtered for an 8-year period, to protect their own national security interests against the irresponsible expansion of NATO up to its borders. And suddenly that's what that pushes Sweden over the edge. So it tells you right off the bat that Sweden's just full of it, literally full of it. That this has nothing to do with national security. This has everything to do with domestic Swedish politics. That's what this is about. It's a politically popular move, and it's done for political reasons. I wish the Swedes would think it through, because one of the things that the Swedes have been doing for the last couple decades is reducing their armed forces. They have a very, very small military, active duty military force. And if they join NATO, that very, very small active duty military force is going to have to become a much larger military force. It's going to cost them a lot of money, and it makes no sense. But that's it. It's Finland. You know, as mad as I am for the Swedes about forgetting Nazi Germany and their neutrality during that awful period during the Second World War, the Finns, it's unforgivable. The Finns forget their own history. They forget that they used to be part of Tsarist Russia. They forget that they fought a their own civil war after declaring independence from Russia, a bloody civil war that was won by right-wing militaristic elements. They forget that they were hostile to the Bolsheviks, so hostile that in 1939, the Soviets said, you're too close to Leningrad. You're too close. We need you to back up a little bit. So we're going to exchange land on the Vyborg Peninsula that pushes you away from Leningrad. We're going to give you some land up here in the north. Please accept this, but we're very worried about your right-wing pro-Nazi nationalism being this close to Leningrad. And the Finns said, stick it in your ear. And so the Soviets invaded. A 3-month war called the Winter War. A lot of people have romanticized it, especially the first month and a half, where the Finns took advantage of Russian military mistakes and gave the Russians a bloody nose. But a lot of people forget the ending of that war, which is the Russians regrouped and were thrashing the Finns in the process of smashing through the vaunted Mannerheim line. And if they did that, they would have a free path to Helsinki and Finland would fall. So the Finns sued for peace. And they gave the Russians the territory that Russia wanted. That should have been the end of the story, except in 1941, Finland then aligned itself with Nazi Germany and participated in the invasion of the Soviet Union, allowing Finnish soil to be used as a jumping off point for German troops. The Finns participated in the encirclement of Leningrad, killing over 1 million Soviet citizens in the process. They allowed their soil to be used by the Nazis to launch offensives against strategic or Soviet military facilities in the north. 1944, once again, Finland found themselves on the receiving end of overwhelming Soviet firepower, and the Finns, recognizing that they were about to be overrun, flopped. They surrendered, they kicked the Germans out, and they basically pleaded for mercy from the Soviet Union. The Soviets gave them mercy. The Soviet Union could have just done away with Finland, occupied it, and they would have every right to do so, to absorb it. But they didn't. They let Finland exist as a modern nation state, but they made Finland sign a treaty in which Finland pledged to be neutral in perpetuity, that Finland would never again allow its soil to be used as a base for foreign troops to threaten the Soviet Union, later Russia. Now, this treaty was allowed to expire, and in 1992, I believe, the Russian Federation signed a new treaty with Finland that did away with some of the more extreme aspects of the 1947 treaty. It said, if you want to join the European Union, European community, go ahead. But you're neutral, and you can never allow your soil to be used as a base for foreign troops to threaten us. So I don't know what part of violating treaties Finland doesn't understand, because for Finland to apply to NATO, and they are violating not only the spirit of every treaty they've signed with the Soviet Union and Russia about neutrality, but the letter. They can never be trusted. And the Finnish military is a little bit bigger than the Swedes, a little bit smaller than the Ukrainians, not nearly as capable as they think it is. And if Russia were to go to war against Finland, Finland would suffer a fate equivalent to or worse than the fate being suffered by Ukraine. They're a smaller country. Their industry is much more tightly located in specific zones, and Russia would destroy it. Russia would destroy their military. That's the fate of Finland if Russia wanted to choose that fate. Now, Vladimir Putin has been very, very mature about this, more mature than I would be if I were the Russian leader. He has said, if Finland and Sweden want to join NATO, that's their business. And if their military posture remains the same, we won't view that as a threat. The moment Finland allows its soil to be used as a base for NATO, that changes the equation totally. But they also said there will be political and military consequences to your actions no matter what. If you join NATO, you forever alter the nature of our relationship. Finland and Russia have enjoyed very close relations for the last 80 years. Friendly relations. Why Finland would want to walk away from this is beyond me, because now they're going to be the enemy of Russia. And Russia now is going to forward deploy new combat forces up to the Finnish border.
Mm-hmm.
Not only that, because Finland is buying F-35A aircraft, 65 of them, I believe. And once Finland becomes a NATO ally, NATO just had a nuclear posture conference earlier this year, where they pretty much said any nation that possesses an F-35A aircraft, the importance of the A designation is nuclear capable. It is capable of delivering nuclear weapons. Any NATO nation that has an F-35A should be considered a potential nuclear delivery device, which means now Poland, for instance, when they buy F-35s, will be considered a potential nuclear delivery state. Finland will be. And if Finland doesn't understand the security implications of nuclear capable F-35s operating from its soil, just a few minutes flight from St. Petersburg, then they're dumber than I ever thought they were. So Russia is going to change. Russia's already said, if you join NATO, the concept of a nuclear-free Baltic region is history. We are going to forward deploy nuclear weapons, and we're going to target every single pathetic little Finnish city there is. The totality of your pathetic little Finnish population will die in a nuclear holocaust if a war ever starts. That's your future, Finland. That's the future you chose. Sweden, that's your future. That's the future you chose. And that's what's going on. Russia's being mature about this, but I don't think we're out of the woodwork yet. I mean, we'll talk about Turkey in a minute, but because I think that might put a significant road bump in Finland and Sweden's plans. But even if Finland and Sweden joined, I don't think their politicians understand the grave consequences of this. It will take Finland 8 months to a year from the moment NATO accepts their application for them to actually become members. And during that time, if they make one slight wrong move, the entire equation can change. And Russia will go from simply wagging an accusatory finger to terminating Finland's existence as a nation state. So this is a very dangerous situation. I don't think Finland and Sweden understand. Even if they successfully join NATO, it will forever change their dynamic, their reality, their geopolitical reality. They will not be more secure. They will find out that they are far less secure. Their population, which has enjoyed this wonderful life of Scandinavian socialism, where, wake up every morning and life is wonderful, the sun is shining, the fields are green, will change. You're going to spend every day of your life living under the imminent threat of nuclear annihilation. That's what you got, Finland, for joining NATO. Enjoy it.
It's really a shame, honestly. It's really a shame. It's not just, the treaty is already one thing, but just the whole nature of it is really a shame. I think people have been duped into a false sense of security. And I mean, what do you answer to people? What do you respond to people who say, well, Russia has shown that, it doesn't respect its neighbors, so it could have gone after Finland. And that's why we're joining NATO, because a lot of people are making that argument now. They're saying, well, Russia has now given life and reason for NATO's existence in the 21st century, even though the Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore, which is a really funny and dishonest way of looking at it. But what do you say to those people?
Well, I'd say that you're ignorant of history. Russia has been saying from 1992 on, or from 1990 on, actually, when it was the Soviet Union, that it opposes the expansion of NATO, that it views the expansion of NATO as an existential threat to Russian security, that there's no reason for the expansion of NATO, that if NATO wants to expand, then NATO should incorporate Russia into that expansion so that an expanding NATO doesn't threaten Russia, because Russia is part of the system. But Russia was excluded from the system. Russia has always been the reason for the expansion of NATO, especially the eastward expansion into former Soviet client states whose governments are openly hostile to Russia. So, it's not Russia that's shown its face as a threat to NATO. It's NATO that has demonstrated repeatedly that it is a threat to Russia. I mean, when you allow the 3 Baltic states to come into NATO, but you refuse to allow their militaries to be included in the conventional forces in Europe force structure that's treaty imposed, therefore deliberately shifting the balance of power in favor of NATO, because now you have 3 states whose militaries are not counted in the force reduction. That's a threat to Russia. When you allow Polish and Romanian soil to be used to house American anti-ballistic missile facilities whose sole functional purpose is to shoot down Russian missiles. They claim it's to shoot down Iranian missiles, but Iran doesn't have a missile that can reach that far. And it's not oriented in a way that could actually make it conducive to shooting down Iranian missiles, but it is oriented in a way to shoot down Russian missiles. This is a threat to Russia. Russia has said over and over again that it is opposed to the eastward expansion of NATO. And it was violently opposed to NATO expanding into the former Soviet republics of Ukraine and Georgia. This wasn't something that Russia just made up right now as an excuse. We know that Russia voiced its concern back in December of 2008 during the Bucharest summit of NATO, where the formal invitation was extended. How do we know this? Because William Burns, the U.S. ambassador to Russia at the time, in February of 2009, wrote a memorandum detailing this. It started, "Niet means niet. No means no, baby. Red line. The Russians are serious about this." And one of the things that Burns cautioned on is that if we ignore this, there will more than likely be a conflict between Russia and Ukraine will lose Crimea and the Donbass. This was known in 2009. That NATO is provoking this. This is the outcome that will happen if NATO continues to provoke, and yet NATO never stopped provoking. In 2014, the European Union and the United States empowered the radical right-wing ideology in Ukraine through the Maidan Revolution to evict a pro-Russian president, to empower a right-wing government that directly threatened the Russian-speaking and ethnic Russian population of southern and eastern Ukraine. And I don't mean politically threatened, I mean violently threatened them. They went to Odessa, put 150 of them into a building, set it on fire, and killed 48 of them. They then tried to take Crimea, but the little green men got in their way, so they moved to Mariupol. You know why there's a fight in Mariupol right now? Because Azov moved in there in May of 2014 and brutally seized the city, raped, murdered, tortured thousands of Russians, and then turned their sights on the Donbass and were making a move there before the Russians in Donbass said, "Niet, we're done, baby. We're fighting you." And that's how the fight started. Now, the amazing thing is when the Russians of Lugansk and Donetsk originally started this fight, they declared independence and they begged Russia to recognize them. And you know, Russia, this horrible, threatening country, you know what they said? No. They said, "You're part of Ukraine. We will support you. We will support your rights. But the solution isn't to divorce you from Ukraine. The solution is to get Ukraine to respect your rights so that you can remain an integral part of Ukraine." That was the Russian approach. Russia only changed that approach 8 years later when the Zelensky government, backed by the Normandy format nations, Germany and France, indicated they would never support the implementation of the Minsk II Accords, signed in 2015, which were supposed to create a special autonomous status for the Russians in Donbass so they wouldn't be affected by the anti-Russian laws that have been passed by the Ukrainian parliament. No, I mean, shame on Russia for being so evil that they refused to dismember Ukraine. Shame on Russia for respecting Ukrainian territorial sovereignty. Shame on Russia for sticking up for the ethnic Russians who are being slaughtered by Nazis. Again, I want to use that word because that's what they are. So any nation that says Russia's actions in Ukraine empower NATO to expand, the argument's exact opposite. It was NATO's actions which prompted, which forced, which compelled Russia's counteraction. And if you aren't a thinking man, then you don't understand that the continued expansion of NATO is only provoking the potential for a similar outcome. And hey, West, if you think you're winning in Ukraine right now, guess again, you're not.
In order to join NATO, every single existing member of NATO has to approve the new candidate. So that has to be unanimous consent. And there's one member that's holding this whole thing up, and it's Turkey. And I think it's important to underscore that Turkey has the second largest army in NATO. So it's not just some random player. And why do you think Turkey doesn't want Finland and Sweden to join? Is this just a game of, is Erdogan basically just bluffing? Does he want concessions? Because, Turkey has been in NATO for close to 70 years, if I'm not mistaken. And, basically they wanted to join the EU for a long time. They haven't been allowed to join the EU. A lot of people in Turkey feel that the country has been isolated by the West. They only want it when it's good for positioning missiles that can reach Russia, but nothing more. So what do you think is going on? Do you think Turkey in the end are going to give way and allow Finland and Sweden to join, or they're going to put their foot down? Because we have to remember they also get a lot of their resources, a lot of their energy from Russia. So they're trying to walk a fine line, right?
Well, I mean, there's no doubt that this is a very political problem for Erdogan. Right off the bat, we need to acknowledge that Turkey is not opposed to the expansion of NATO. So it's not as though Turkey has said we're against the inclusion of Sweden and Finland because it will provoke Russia and put NATO in a tenuous position. So that should be worrisome to everybody who views NATO expansion as problematic, because Turkey's not against NATO expansion. Turkey is against bringing into the NATO alliance nations who have exhibited what they believe to be extreme anti-Turkish policies, especially when it comes to support for the Turkish Kurds, the PKK. Sweden in particular has provided a safe haven, political empowerment for the PKK on Swedish soil. Finland and Sweden have both participated in arms embargoes against Turkey for their Kurdish policies. And Turkey also remembers that when they moved into Syria in order to what they believed was to defend themselves, defend their interests, that NATO didn't back it up. So, Turkey sought Article 4 engagement by NATO. NATO refused to provide it. NATO refused to consider it. Turkey also remembers that when it made a deal with Libya, at least one part of Libya, over the extension of the Turkish maritime border, so that it coincided with Libya in the middle of the Mediterranean, therefore creating a Turkish-Libyan bridge that gives Turkey expansive ability to exploit that region for oil and gas. That NATO and European Union was against it. Turkey remembers, for instance, that French and Greek warships threatened a Turkish supply convoy that was on its way to Libya, that Turkey had to threaten to sink those ships in order to get the convoy through, and that France went to NATO and was condemning Turkey and NATO. So Turkey has a lot of grudges against NATO already. And then to allow NATO to expand to include 2 new members who are anti-Turkish in terms of their policies is unacceptable. So I think Erdogan has made it clear that both Finland and Sweden, but especially Sweden, would have to change their policy 100%, and Sweden can't do it. Sweden simply can't do it. Sweden now is whispering sweet nothings towards Turkey, promising certain things, but Sweden can't do it, and they especially can't do it in the time period required. I mean, let's just say that if you really want to, to have the extradition of PKK members, imagine the legal process that would be that would be required for that. Finland, they would have to change their laws. There would have to be dates. We're talking about a process that could take years. So even if the Sweden government went, yes, we want to get rid of the PKK. PKK is going to hire a bunch of Swedish lawyers, and this thing's going to get tied down and in Stockholm forever. And then human rights aspects of the European Union, European Commission are going to kick in, and it will never happen. So Turkey has created a huge problem right now. Now, Some people think that Turkey can be bribed. For instance, Turkey has indicated that, hey, it might like those F-35 aircraft that the U.S. won't sell them anymore, but now they'd like those. Hey, we'd like the U.S. to drop sanctions over the S-400. Maybe we'll even buy another bunch of S-400s. But Erdogan, this to go down that path disrespects the sincerity of the Turkish position vis-a-vis the Kurds. To imagine a scenario where Turkey would allow the continued political empowerment of the PKK in Europe in exchange for F-35 aircraft. First of all, Erdogan would lose all credibility as a national leader. So I don't think Turkey can be bribed. I think Turkey has said, if you want to improve relations with us, you need to give us these weapons, but we're still insisting on the changes that are going to have to happen. So I think Turkey, if they stick to their guns, they're doing the world a huge, huge favor. They're doing NATO a huge favor because at some point in time, the governments that currently exist in Finland and Sweden are not going to be governing anymore. I think when, for instance, some of the economic realities are going to hit Europe in the next weeks, months, and over the course of especially the coming year, that many politicians who are currently in power won't be in power anymore because there's going to be huge social harm, and that tends to result in constituents holding those whom they elect to higher office accountable for what they do in their name, meaning they'll vote them out. So, and with new political leadership, new priorities, Finland and Sweden may rethink their NATO membership going forward. And also, over time, Russia is going to prevail in Ukraine eventually. And at that point in time, NATO is going to have to talk about what the future relationship with Russia is going to be. Do they want a renewal of the old Cold War, where they spent, hundreds of billions of dollars to have a permanent forward deployed combat ready capability on the border with Russia, so that Europe lives at a hair trigger of war? Or do they want to consider a new European security framework that de-emphasizes conflict? And I think when the reality of the cost of war to Ukraine becomes known to Europe, I think Europe will be aghast and will say, we need to ensure this never happens again. And the best way to ensure it never happens again is to create the conditions that avoid conflict, as opposed to create conditions that make conflict more likely. And in that context, the eastward expansion of NATO might be suddenly frowned upon by NATO membership. But I think Turkey's doing us a big favor. I think Turkey's very serious about its stance, and I don't think Finland and Sweden are going to be fast-tracked into NATO.
What did you make of Lavrov's comments a few weeks ago? So the Russian foreign minister, he was giving an interview, and he warned that the risk of nuclear war is quite real. It's very real. I know we were talking just a bit earlier about how this is normal, that the Americans give intelligence which results in the death of Russians. They don't take it personally, or they put on their big boy pants, as you put it. But nevertheless, all of these factors in general, let's take in NATO expansionism into account, even if it looks like Turkey might block it. Do you think Lavrov's comments are realistic? Do you think that's something that we should be worried about? Because if there was ever a time, it feels like it's the time right now. How close do you think we are?
Well, we are literally 1 second away from global and nuclear annihilation every minute of every day. All it takes is a miscalculation. Generally speaking, you'd like a situation where Europe, the United States, and Russia are working on de-escalation, on reducing the opportunities for miscalculation. This is why both the United States and Russia deliberately detargeted their strategic nuclear forces. That means that all the missiles that are in silos, all the missiles that are in submarines right now, don't have any targets assigned to them. It used to be that when a submarine sailed out, every warhead had a target. It was part of the single SIOP, single integrated operation plan, I think it is, the nuclear war plan. And every silo, every missile in a silo had a target already programmed in. So now what's happened is in order for those missiles to hit a target, a deliberate decision has to be made to pick a target, send that target to the missile in question, have that target programmed into the missile, and then fire. So it buys us time, hopefully, to engage our brains and understand that this is really, really stupid. But now that we are, getting closer for the potential of conflict, I think, Russia's already said that it's increased its readiness posture. That doesn't mean that they've increased their DEFCON, their defense, the way their military is prepared, but it meant that they are fully manning command posts now, that they've taken one additional step necessary to make themselves fully combat capable from a nuclear standpoint, because they recognize that the United States and NATO are leaning forward in a way that threatens Russia. Lavrov's statements. Remember, Russia in, I think, 2020 published for the first time ever its nuclear posture, its policies, and the circumstances on which they will launch nuclear weapons. And both Putin and Lavrov have not said anything that deviates from this stated policy. In fact, they've said over and over again, what our policy is. It's stated right there. But one of them is, should hostile nations using conventional forces threaten the existential survival of Russia, Russia would use nuclear weapons in response. And NATO needs to understand that any potential for a military thrust that, for instance, risks St. Petersburg being captured is an existential crisis, an issue of existential survival. NATO needs to understand that if they deploy Dark Eagle hypersonic missiles, hypervelocity missiles into Germany, that they now have created a potential decapitation scenario. And the Russian nuclear posture says that if there is a decapitation attack against the Russian leadership, even if it's non-nuclear, Russia will launch all of its nuclear weapons. So we are in a situation now where NATO is considering and doing extreme things. I mean, it doesn't take much of a leap of imagination to go from using intelligence to empower Ukrainians to kill Russian generals to somebody in Washington, D.C. saying, hey, we have a window of opportunity here to take out Putin and his entire leadership. Crazier things have happened. So Russia is basically putting a marker on the table saying there will be consequences to anything like this. So stop behaving as if you live in a consequence-free world. We may not be striking out at you now for sinking our ships, killing our generals, but if you continue to escalate down this path, there will be consequences, and one of those consequences is nuclear war.
It's quite frightening. Honestly, I thought there were many lessons in the Cold War, and apparently none of them have been learned. I wanted to ask you, Scott, about when it comes to the ripple effect that the war in Ukraine has had, because this has far-reaching implications that are outside of Ukraine's borders. One of them has been, for example, Russia demanding gas payments in rubles. And do you think, just right off the bat, do you think that NATO saw this coming? Do you think the EU saw this coming? Because we must remember that European countries, about 40% of their gas comes from Russia. And right now, I think there's just about 5 countries that have signed on to this scheme who've basically accepted, like, yeah, okay, well, we will swallow our pride and pay in rubles, because they don't really have a choice, right? That includes Austria, Germany, Hungary, Slovakia, and I think Italy. Do you think they saw this coming? And, what are your thoughts on Europe's energy security, that they want to get LNG now from the United States and so on? This seems a little far-fetched that the EU wants to transition in 9 months. That's what von der Leyen is saying. 9 months. They want to wean off of Russian energy. I mean, I don't understand where she gets this timeline from.
Well, the short answer is no, Europe didn't see this coming. Look, I think the United States and Europe had been laboring under the false pretense that Russia's economy was dangerously weak and vulnerable to the kind of sanctions that they were planning, that Russia would not be able to survive for any length of time, that the ruble would collapse, that the Russian stock market would collapse, that the Russian economy would collapse, and that Vladimir Putin's political future would be put at risk by an outraged Russian population. They bought into this. They believed this. They thought that this was real. The mistake they made, not only in believing that, was in continuously threatening Russia with, the consequences of unprecedented sanctions, massive. I mean, remember Joe Biden went to Geneva, Switzerland in June of 2021 and stared Putin in the eye and told him right off the bat, there will be consequences you can't imagine if you invade Ukraine. We will hit you with unprecedented sanctions that have never been seen before. And Putin went, Spasiba. Thank you very much, dude. He went back and he had months to prepare. And he has some of the smartest people in the world. The Russians know energy better than just about anybody else. I think maybe the Saudis and the Iranians might have some knowledge about energy. But Russia knows energy very well. And Russia also knew a couple other things. Because remember, Biden also came out during his question and answer period. And I don't want to tell you what the Russian president's thing, but I told him, beware of China. China's got this giant border, and there's a lot of Chinese, and they have a big economy, and they're going to swallow you up. And you need to be worried about China. And Putin went, Spasiba, bro. Thank you for filling me in on that. Where apparently Biden wasn't listening to anything that either Putin or Chinese President Xi Jinping were saying, such as, "Hey, we're best friends, and we have a relationship that transcends an alliance. Forget NATO. NATO is a limiting feature. We have something that's unlimited because it's not constrained by an alliance. We're stronger than an alliance." And one of the things that Putin and Xi did was meet on February 4th. Big meeting in Beijing, the one where we boycotted because we're the dumbest people on the face of the earth. Did we not understand that if Joe Biden had traveled to China to be part of the Olympic opening ceremony, that the Chinese president would have been compelled to meet with him, and that the Chinese policy establishment would have said, we can't do a major bid with Russia right now with the American president here, that we have to balance things out. But we liberated the Chinese and the Russians, who sat down on 4 February and issued a 5,000 plus word joint statement, which redefined the world. I don't think the average American understands what happened there. It's not a joke. They don't play games. These are serious people. And they basically said, the age of American singularity is over. It's no longer a unipolar world. We don't care about America anymore. We can live without America. We are going to cooperate with each other. We are going to create something called the Trans-Eurasian Economic Union, and we're going to work on developing a new economic reality and center of gravity that's independent of the United States and Europe. And everybody went, oh, what does that mean? Well, it means it's over, Europe. It's over, the United States. Game, set, match. Because now Russia has created economic depth. So people were saying, if Russia can never shut off oil in Europe, because if Russia does that, they won't have anybody to sell their gas to. Well, now Russia's selling gas to the Chinese, the Indians, and just about everybody else, not in the same quantities. Guess what, world? Let me give you a little economic hint. If the price of gas goes up 2 times, Russia only needs to sell half as much gas, and they're still making the same amount of money.
Exactly.
So, you guys are geniuses, Europe. Nobody took this seriously. So when they imposed the sanctions, they fully anticipated that Russia would fold like a house of cards. What is one of the first things that the Russians did? First thing they did is they didn't shut off the gas. Why? I mean, think about it. Russia could destroy Germany and Austria today. You want all the lights to go out in Vienna?
No thanks.
Russia can make that happen. They can make that happen right now. They just got to hit the off switch, and it's done. And to be honest, after Germany and Austria, not so much Austria, but other European countries participated in the theft of $650 billion worth of Russian sovereign funds, wealth funds, theft, outright theft.
It's piracy, state piracy.
Yeah, it's, they're seizing hundreds of millions of dollars worth of yachts for no legal reason, and for imposing sanctions that are specifically designed to bring harm to the Russian people, specifically designed to bring harm to the Russian people. Russia would have every reason to say, stick it in your ear, here's the off switch, live with the consequences, guys. We can last longer than you can, до свидания. But Russia didn't. Why? Because Russia has always said, and it's an accurate statement, that we will not weaponize energy.
Right. That
energy is our lifeblood. That's what our economy is built on. So we can't be seen as weaponizing it, because trust me, if Russia weaponizes it against Europe, you think the Chinese aren't going to sit there and say, well, it's someday you might turn off the off switch to us, or the Indians will say the same thing. You know, we don't always have perfect relations. What if you get mad at us and you turn off the off switch? So Russia is making the point that no matter what, it will adhere to its contracts.
Yep.
But now this becomes a touchy subject, because if the contract says you have to pay, or we pay in dollars or euros, okay, but you just stole all my dollars and euros. You froze every dollar and euro I have in your bank account. So what you're basically telling me is, I have to let you pay me in money that goes into a bank account that you're going to freeze. And so you're getting energy for free, because you're going to take that money, seize it, and what? Give it back to yourself, reallocate it as you see fit. But Russia doesn't get a penny. Yep. So Russia said, no, that's not how it's going to work. What you're going to do is buy rubles. Now they've come up with a fancy scheme that basically the Europeans will deposit money into a bank, the bank will change it into rubles and all that. But remember, what's happening here is Russia's getting paid. Because the other way, Russia wouldn't have gotten paid. The other way, they would have said, we fulfilled our contract by paying you in dollars and euros, but we've seized them and you don't get any money. And Russia said, we're going to get our money, or you're not going to get your gas. And enough nations have realized that without gas, they die. So they're paying for it in rubles. But now here's the other thing, because according to Joe Biden, I destroyed the ruble. I crushed the ruble. It's got no value. The ruble is finished. Except Putin went, yeah, but you shouldn't have told me that back in June, Joe, because guess what we've done? We've linked it to the gold standard, and we've linked it to Russian commodities, which are worth a lot today, a lot more today than they were before you implemented sanctions. Thanks, Joe. You really helped us out here, buddy. So the price of lithium's gone through the roof. We're making a lot of money selling lithium.
Let me show you. Let me show you the value of the ruble right now. This is live. It's 62 to the dollar. I think it's the highest it's ever been since December 2019.
Yep. And it's going to get stronger, because and the other thing, again, I'm not an economic genius. Last thing, just ask my wife about our personal budget. She runs it, or else we'd be bankrupt. Because money and me don't mix, but because I don't understand it. But the fact of the matter is, they were talking about inflation, that one of the goals was to destroy the Russian economy, is to get the ruble to collapse and inflation to go out of control. My understanding is that Russia's inflation level is actually shrinking when everybody else is going through the roof. In the United States, 7.8%? Europe, it's punching 10%. In some areas, they're talking about potential 20% inflation if this thing does, if these prices don't come under control. And Russia's brought the inflation under control. The Russian stock exchange, they had to shut it down while they adjusted to new reality. But the last time I checked, there were little green arrows on the Russian stock exchange. It's doing okay. Last time I checked the Dow, there were big red arrows. It was collapsing.
Yeah.
One of the reasons why it was collapsing is because of inflationary realities brought on by the high price of fuel. And why do we have high gas? Because we've embargoed Russian energy. We've removed Russia as a player from the energy market, and the energy market hasn't been able to adapt. Now, Europe says, oh, we got this covered. We got a plan. They don't have a plan. They have a PowerPoint. There's a difference between, a European politician putting a PowerPoint up on the wall with all sorts of fancy graphics indicating how great the world is going to be and reality. Let me give you one thing. They've projected a budget based upon a present day reality, 210 billion euros. Well, have they looked at the price of diesel gas recently, diesel fuel? It's going through the roof. And if you know anything about diesel, you know it powers this interesting vehicle called a truck.
Mm-hmm.
And the truck tends to be used to drag along these things called trailers. And these trailers contain things called consumer goods. And the way the economy in Europe and the United States works is that we have this carefully balanced relationship between supply and demand. And so, Walmart has a store. That store is filled with goods. The goods are supposed to be bought, and as they're bought, they're replaced. You don't want to have too much goods coming in because now you don't have any place to store it. You don't want to have too little goods coming in because shelves will be empty. You strike this fine balance. In order to achieve that balance, you have these things called trucks with trailers that move around the country and keep everything balanced out perfectly, wonderfully. And the prices are low when the cost of transportation is low. Because believe me, the cost of transportation is everything. Everything's built around that. Right now, we have diesel going through the roof. And when diesel goes through the roof, all those trucks, that cost more now. And so where are they going to take that? The truckers aren't going to sit here and take a loss so that you and I can buy, well, not you, I don't know how many Walmarts you have in Vienna, but we got a Walmart here, so I can go buy cheap Chinese made shirts or whatever. The trucker's going to say, no, at some point in time, I'm transferring the cost to you, the consumer. And suddenly the cost of goods go way up. But it's not just the cost of goods, it's the whole supply chain, the cost of everything. And it collapses, it breaks down. Walmart is in danger of going out of business. Walmart in America is in danger of going out of business. Amazon is in danger of going out of business. All of America is in danger of going out of business because our entire economy is built around this damn diesel fueled truck that ain't going to move anywhere if the price goes too high because no one can make money. You can't, it just doesn't work that way. Meanwhile, while the price of everything's going up because of diesel and everything, my paycheck's staying the same. And, so I receive X amount of money per month. That's okay. My wife figured out how to spend it so that we live comfortably. If I spent it, we would collapse into chaos and anarchy. But she's managed to turn this into a well-functioning economic machine. But that's based upon a budget that's premised on X amount of dollars coming in and the cost of life being, or Y. But now the cost is going Y plus Z. My paycheck's staying X. It ain't changing. But it is. It's not worth as much. So I can't buy the things that I used to in the quantities. It costs me, 1/3 as much to fill my my gas tank. It used to be, $36. It's now $52 to fill the gas tank, and it's going to go up. And it costs now. We go to the store. We buy beef, because we're Americans. We eat beef. The price has gone through the roof. So we want to shift to vegetables because I want to be healthy and lose some of this weight. But the cost of vegetables has gone up because we don't grow tomatoes here in New York. We don't grow the lettuce. It's grown in California, and it's got to be shipped here on a truck that uses diesel. And so the prices have gone through the roof, and they're going to go even higher. And Biden has talked about we're going to suffer a little pain. No, Biden, we're going to shut down. And Europe's going to shut down. This is just the reality of it. They haven't thought it through. The United States says we'll help underwrite the cost of LNG transition,
Yeah.
so that you're going to pay what we pay. Well, that'll last for how long? Because the one thing I know about the United States is we are greedy as hell. And also, you know how much natural gas the United States government owns? Pro hint, zero. It's owned by companies. they bring it out. And so at some point in time, the companies are going to sit there and say, okay, we've carried you long enough, but now you got to pay the going market rate. And guess what? The going market rate in 2024 is going to be 3.5 times the amount you're paying for Russian gas right now.
Yep.
And so that bill is going to hit Europe instantly. They're going to go from paying a subsidized hypothetical gas bill of €100 a month, and suddenly it's going to come in and go, no, you owe us 500 euros right now, but I haven't budgeted for that. I don't have, because I'm spending money on green transformation and this and that, all the wonderful little European stuff. Sorry, dude, you can't afford to do anything. You can't, because you made the decision to walk away from the cheapest gas in the world. Now you're going to pay the price.
But Scott, I heard on CNN that this is Putin's price hike, and he's the one responsible. He's sitting there in the Kremlin and, raising the prices as we speak for no reason. Man, honestly, this childishness, it's infantile, really. It's so ridiculous and Twilight Zone watching them talk like this. I think this is one of the big reasons why people don't understand. They don't know what's coming, and it's only when the train hits them that they're really going to understand what this war costs. It's very nice to say, oh, it's about European values, Western values, about democracy, which is a funny way to say, we're arming Nazis. But, when it really hits them, then they're going to understand, unfortunately. And, you were talking about the payment mechanism before. I think it was a win-win. I think what the Russians did was very pragmatic, because they want rubles, but the buyers still get to send euros and dollars. So it really doesn't change anything for them. They're still sending the exact same currency in the exact same amount. It's like you said, if the Russians really wanted to be bad boys, they could just turn the switch off or raise the prices themselves. It's game over. So I think they've been a lot more patient than some of us would be, honestly.
They're the only adults in the room. They're literally the only adults in the room.
Yeah, it's really looking that way. It's really looking that way. And I wanted to ask you what you think of Venezuela, because right now the Americans they sent in March a delegation to Venezuela to talk about bringing Venezuelan oil back on the market. Well, right now, just a few hours ago, it looks like they've removed some sanctions on Venezuela, not completely, but the idea is that Chevron, which is the American oil company that owns most of the infrastructure in Venezuela that has the most invested, they're allowed to engage in talks with the Venezuelans. They're not allowed to drill. They're not allowed to do anything else, only to talk. But it's a sign that they're easing sanctions, and they're going to try and replace, I guess, the Russian oil, which was about 250,000 barrels a day that the U.S. was bringing in, with what Venezuela used to give the Americans actually in 2018. There was also the roughly the same amount. What do you think of all that? Because some people are saying, oh, we shouldn't talk to a dictator, but they don't have a problem with energy from Saudi Arabia.
I mean, it's funny. Look, let's start off again with just some reality, because it's not just oil. Venezuelan oil, oil that's produced in Venezuela is not the same as oil that comes out of the ground in Saudi Arabia, which is not the same as oil that comes out of the ground in Iran or elsewhere. It's got different levels of sulfur, different levels. You got sweet oil, you got sour oil, etc. And to refine it requires a specific refining process. So refineries can't just interchange oil. You can't one day go, okay, we got the Venezuelan oil in, shut that up. We got the Saudi oil coming in now. No, the refinery is actually geared for efficiency of operation to handle Venezuelan oil.
Right.
And Venezuelan oil was right there. I mean, so most of the refineries in the Gulf Coast are geared towards Venezuelan oil. And so when we shut down Venezuelan oil, ask yourself why we're buying a specific amount of oil from Russia, but it's not just an amount of oil, it's a specific grade of oil. I think it's called Mazur or something of that nature, because it most closely replicates the chemical composition of the Venezuelan oil, so that the refinery doesn't have to be changed. So we shut down the Venezuelans. We went and bought the oil from the Russians, who are only happy to sell it to us because they make money. But now we're going to shut down the oil from Russia. We haven't yet, by the way. The tankers are still coming because we don't have the Venezuelan oil, and we need the Russian oil because the refinery won't accept anything else. But shh, don't tell anybody that. But now we want the Venezuelans to pump oil and bring it to us. Now, Venezuela's in a, it's an interesting situation here. How we said, why are we talking to Maduro? He's not the president.
Right, that's what I heard.
Why don't we call in Juan Guaido and get him to sign us a wonderful, because Juan Guaido is a puppet and everybody knows he's a puppet, and it's done, finished. Second, we went crawling to Maduro. That was the end of Juan Guaido. He has nothing. The Venezuelans, I think every sovereign country has to make decisions for themselves. I would just say, as an outside observer, I'll start off by saying that Nicolas Maduro is not stupid, and that the people surrounding him aren't stupid. But I'll also say that they are Venezuelan politicians whose responsibility is to the Venezuelan people, not to the people of Iran or the people of Russia or the people of the United States, to the Venezuelan people. And Venezuela has been suffering tremendously. So I think that there is going to be a balance struck, but Venezuela would be foolish to believe that the United States would agree to anything in perpetuity. That whatever the United States is seeking, it's short-term benefit for the United States. But at the end of the day, Venezuela will always be vulnerable to America suddenly waking up saying, well, we don't want to deal with dictators anymore. So, because America is incapable of having a pure business relationship. We have to have strings attached on everything. We have to control everything. We have to own you, dominate you, and compel you to do our bidding when we want. We're not very good with dealing with truly sovereign states that can actually make their own decisions. So Venezuela's got a balancing act to do. I don't think Venezuela is going to totally turn its back on the United States, because even the nations that are providing Venezuela support, right now, how much, can Russia really provide support now that the international sanctions have hit it? Is it really fair to ask Russia to provide that support? There's only so much support China can provide. Mm-hmm. Iran has provided a tremendous amount of support, but Iran's getting ready to maybe rejoin the international community in terms of energy security on its own. So I think Venezuela has to look out for its own self-interest and use whatever leverage it has right now to get the best deal possible from the United States, but in a way that preserves Nicolas Maduro's hold on power. So they're in the catbird seat. They're going to get to call the shots. It's just going to be interesting to see, how this proceeds, because the U.S. is really in a bind. They desperately need the Venezuelan oil. But, politics being politics, we have people right now in Congress are saying, we can't deal with Nicolas Maduro. He's a horrible dictator. He's not even the legitimate president. Juan Guaido is a recognized president, we box ourselves yet again into a corner that we're trying to get out. The guy I feel sorry for most of all is a guy named Jim Story, American diplomat. He used to be the charge of the affair in Venezuela. He was the last senior diplomat in Caracas before we cut relations. He then went to Colombia, and he's running the Venezuelan interest desk in Bogota. And for a while, his job was regime change. And he's the guy that helped manage all that nonsense about coups and all this stuff. Well, Jim Story had to lead the delegation that had to crawl.
No way! And you're kidding.
This is an honorable man.
Oh no,
he's an honorable man. He's an intelligent man. But he has to implement the policy of the United States, and it just shows you how how the U.S. policy has just gravitated from running a coup 6 months ago to crawling on our knees begging for a new relationship today. And if you're the same guy running a coup and they make you crawl, that's just got to make you really, really uncomfortable. And
Yeah.
Maduro was just sitting there enjoying the whole show, going, "Yeah, baby, keep crawling." So I feel sorry for him because he's not a bad guy. He's a good guy. He's a smart guy. But it just shows you how U.S. policy is just literally impossible to defend.
Oh man, that is a real plot twist. I mean, the principle alone, I knew Maduro must be sitting there laughing, but this is really something else. Wow. Oh wow, that's I don't want to be in his shoes. I really don't. That's a big one. And you mentioned Iran actually coming back on the international scene with their oil. That's also directly related to this because I should know, I'm one of the only people covering it. The Iran talks, they were happening, but they were dragging their feet. And all of a sudden, in the span of a few weeks, they're like, we want you back and we're ready to sign. And then, everything's come to a standstill now. But that'll be interesting to see with Iran, because I think they're also looking out for their own self-interest, which again is not a bad thing. They've been through a lot, so that's what these countries are going to do right now. And I wanted to ask you, Scott, about when it comes to I'm sort of diverging here on the topic, but when it comes to this Pentagon investigation. I don't know if you saw this. The Pentagon investigated the strike in Syria in 2019 that was revealed by the New York Times, and there were about, I think, 60 civilians killed, or 60 plus. And they found no wrongdoing. Basically, I just wanted to get your thoughts on this whole story and the chain of command and how they proceeded with it. And it's they basically released some memo saying that they're gonna hold the investigations to higher standards next time, but there's no accountability. And how does that tie in with what's happening in Russia and Ukraine? Because they're saying they want to put Putin on trial and they want to put these Russians on trial. And yet, when the shoe's on the other foot, when it's NATO or the US killing civilians, they don't seem to care. It's just, we investigated it and found nothing wrong.
Well, here's the thing, and I'm probably going to irritate a lot of people saying this, but I'm just going to speak truth here. It's very, very, very hard to prosecute a war crime in a time of war. I'm going to say something else that people may not want to hear. Civilians die during war. Get over it. If you don't want civilians to die, don't go to war. That's just the way it is. And, and so we start off with that premise that, what the activist calls a war crime is very rarely a war crime. Now let's talk about what happened in Syria. When the United States engaged in the anti-ISIS coalition in 2014 into 2015, we made a decision that we were going to provide air power, but we were going to limit boots on the ground, so to speak. And so initially we brought in these targeting cells, usually special forces, that would coordinate with the supported forces removed from the front lines. And then they would get intelligence from the guys on the front. And it was just too unwieldy. It was, we weren't able to get the bombs on the right targets in the right time frame. So the decision was made to push the special forces forward and to have direct links with the forward elements, the fighting elements. And this worked with the Iraqis. We actually trained up some Iraqi special forces to be very good at coordinating with U.S. special forces to identify targets. They had good communications equipment. They were able to get the information up to the drones or the strike aircraft and get the bombs on target. A lot of civilians died, but you know what? Again, war is hell, and issues of proportionality and military necessity are basically a decision made by commanders on the ground who take a look at a military target, determine what the value, the military necessity is for striking that target. They balance in, what gain we get over destroying military capability X, balanced against potential civilian casualty Y, and that's called proportionality. And if they make a determination that we get greater benefit than the risk, we blow up the target, and sayonara civilians. I'm sorry, that's just the way it is. It ain't a war crime. It's hell. That's
but
this unit,
this unit specifically, I think it's referred to as Task Force 9. Who knows if that's actually the real name? But they are actually going around doing multiple things. One of those, if I'm not mistaken, was the Tupcut Dam. So that was on a no strike list, and they hit it anyway. And because it's public infrastructure.
We'll get them in a second, because I'm talking about Iraq and how this developed.
Right.
One of the ways this developed is that we gave the Iraqis, we trained them up with a special communication system that enabled them to target and then transmit that target directly. And so they became the trigger pullers, but because they were Iraqi government and they were working with the American, it was a government on government thing. It was legal. But then the war against ISIS expanded into Syria. And here's where we have a problem, because the only government in Syria is the Syrian government, and we're not allied with them. In fact, we were actively conspiring to overthrow them. The only people that we were working with were the Syrian Defense Forces. Well, that's the name we gave them. They used to be called PKK or the PDY or PYP or whatever. But the bottom line is they're affiliated with the PKK, a named terrorist group. The Turks call them terrorists. We call them terrorists. And yet they're the ones that we're now fighting with against ISIS. So we had them rename themselves into the Syrian Defense Forces, or Democratic Forces, I think it was. The word democratic because it sounded good. But at the end of the day, they're still terrorists, and we're not really allowed to work with these terrorists. But we had this unique system because, again, remember, we don't want to suffer casualties. So we don't want to be the ones on the front line engaging ISIS directly. So we gave the PKK the same capabilities that we gave the Iraqis, but we have even less direct control over it because they're terrorists and we have to sort of moderate how we deal with them. And so there was a targeting assumption made that there was more American control over the targeting than there actually was, because the people really calling in the strikes were the terrorists. And they would do things, for instance, in clearing a city. Normally, you have criteria of dropping a bomb, and it's got to be a sniper in a building, enemy infantry in the building, a machine gun in the building. You have to see something. And what was happening is because the Syrian Democratic Forces didn't want to suffer casualties, every building had a sniper in it. And so they just literally go down the street and go, okay, a building A31, sniper, drop a bomb, laser guided bomb will come down, boom, take it out. They'd move on. There was no sniper in there. There may have been a couple families in there, but they didn't want to lose any guys searching the building. So they just blew everything up. And they would attack targets that were on no drop zones, et cetera. What happened with the civilians, they were in a fight for one of the last villages. And this was a particularly bloody fight. That ISIS was, they were underground, they had tunnels, they had bunkers, and they would pop up behind the Kurds, they would kill Kurds, they would pop down below, move in. And so the Kurds had it up to here with them. The other thing that they would do is use civilians as shields. So they would bring out the women and children and then integrate their soldiers and their fighters and then move and go from one area to the next. And so basically at some stage in this battle, the fighters came out and they integrated with a large number of women and children, and they were deemed to be a target. They were called enemy in the open by the Kurds who were controlling it. Airstrike was delivered, and the target was eliminated. This was all done in accordance with Task Force 9's protocol. Where the problem came in is that there was another asset above it, controlled not by Task Force 9, but by people, I believe, operating in the Persian Gulf, I think out of Oman or something like that, Al Udeid Air Base, in Qatar maybe. And they saw the strike. they didn't understand any of the context that was going on, and they called it a war crime. And so this was an investigation started by people who were not in the chain of command, were not in the chain of decision making, and had no idea what the context of what the reality on the ground was. They called it a war crime. It was investigated as a war crime. But the bottom line is ISIS had made use of women and children as a human shield. That's a war crime in itself. And the Kurds had made a decision about proportionality, and they decided that they weren't willing to suffer any more casualties at the hands of ISIS, so they took the threat out. That's the situation. I think the crime here is that Task Force 9 did not exercise adequate control over the Kurds. But the problem is, how do you exercise adequate control over an organization that officially your government recognizes as a terrorist organization? I mean, this shows you the insanity of what we were doing in Syria to begin with.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just the strike, that one. It's also the Topka Dam, because that was, I mean, it's a dam. It's civilian infrastructure. So by definition, it's a war crime to attack it. And they dropped a bomb in it, and actually the dam didn't overflow, because the estimate was that if it had overflown, it would have killed more people than in the entire Syrian war. I still can't wrap my head around that, but the U.S. drone strike the engineers who fixed it. It's really heartbreaking and messed up. And I think this Task Force 9, because even if the incident that you just talked about in March 2019, even if we say, okay, well, that was a legitimate one, there's so many things. It reminds me of the British SAS and the Australian SAS, going around just claiming they were being threatened, kind of, misusing that self-defense argument. And it's not exactly the same situation. That was in close quarters with knives and things like that. But yeah, I mean, the thing is that for me, it's like, no matter the rationale, if a Syrian unit was going around the United States blowing up civilians, for whatever reason, Americans would never tolerate that. They call it a war crime. Right. And when the Russians are doing it, it's a war crime. And ironically, even when the Syrian army and Russia are fighting ISIS in the same context, where there's civilian shields, there's human shield, and so on, they also call it a war crime.
It's a war crime. Yeah.
Yeah, the double standard is pretty crazy.
It's like, look, just because when I said that it's very difficult to prosecute a war crime, that doesn't mean that I'm happy about it. I'm just stating the fact that it's almost impossible to prosecute a war crime, because I'll tell you, even with the dam, if I'm a military lawyer, I'll shut down your prosecution this quick, because all I have to do is show you that the military commander believed that there was a threat worthy of the strike. That's all I have to do, because it all comes down to intent. What was the intent of the military commander at the time he ordered the strike? And if the intent had a military pure reason, even if we make it up after the fact, you aren't going to prosecute. And because you're totally prisoner to my interpretation of intent, unless the idiot commander got on the radio and broadcast in clear that, hey, there's 15 civilians there, no military reason to do it, but I'm going to blow it up anyways because I'm mad at these civilians, and you intercept that conversation, now you have evidence of a war crime. But lacking that, almost every good military commander is going to back up every decision he makes with paperwork. And part of that paperwork is going to be carefully documented threat assessment that gives a military justification for the use. And the reason why is that most of the time there are lawyers attached to the command. And the job of the lawyer is to review this stuff and make sure that you have taken into consideration issues of proportionality, military necessity, et cetera, so that you can't be accused of a war crime. So it's very difficult to prosecute war crimes, very difficult.
What do you make of the Russians then saying they're going to set up a Nuremberg-style tribunal? And I believe there's the first Russian soldier who's been prosecuted now in Ukraine for war crimes. I'll just double check that though. But what are your thoughts on all this?
No, there was a Russian sergeant that pled guilty. I will tell you this: had that trial taken place with competent defense attorney, he would not have been found guilty of a war crime. because what he was guilty of is shooting a 60-year-old civilian because he feared that civilian would compromise his position to Ukrainian forces, putting him and his fellow soldiers at risk. It's the same situation we faced during the Gulf War. I'll give you a couple examples. In the Scud hunts, we had a situation where Delta Force teams were inserted, were in their hide site, and were discovered by Bedouins, goat herders. Now, military necessity is that you are behind enemy lines. If you are compromised, you are extremely susceptible to being wiped out. So the decision is, do I shoot the goat herder? Do I capture the goat herder? But then what do I do with the goat herder? Or do I let the goat herder go? Had the decision made to shoot the goat herder, while the Iraqis may have screamed war crime, they wouldn't have been charged with war crimes because there was military necessity in the move. Fortunately, on every single occasion, the U.S. troops involved and the British troops involved in compromises opted not to shoot civilians because basic human decency took over, and they accepted the consequences of compromise, which in the case of Delta Force meant they were running for their lives. In the case of the British, it meant that they got in a firefight and lots of them lost their lives. But had they shot the civilian, it's not a war crime, military necessity. So I would have defended that Russian sergeant differently, that he's a Russian soldier on active duty. His convoy had been ambushed. He was running for his life. He had been compromised, and he made the decision to take out the civilian to protect himself. That's the way I would have defended it. He's alone in a Ukrainian court. It's not a fair defense. He pled guilty to something that I believe a good lawyer would have gotten him off in a court of proper jurisdiction. Now, this is a world of difference between the trials that the Russians are about to have. These aren't, they're not trying Ukrainian soldiers for war crimes committed in conflict against Russia. They're trying Azov members primarily for the crimes committed in Donbass from 2014 to 2022, prior to the special military operation. They're charging them with murder, with rape, and things of that nature. They've got the evidence, they've got the witness. They've had 8 years to prepare these prosecutions. They know exactly who they want. They know them by name. And it's going to be quite embarrassing for these people when they go on trial, because the Azov people have felt sort of immune, like they'll never be held to account. So they've done amazing things like admit their guilt on videotape. They've posted their crimes on the internet, on social media. They've proclaimed their Nazi status on social media. So this is one of the easiest prosecutions they've ever had. They're going to bring the guy in. They're going to play the video of him admitting his crime. They're going to bring in the witness and say, yep, he's the one that raped that girl. Yep, he's the one that murdered those people. Yep, he's the one to do that. And the guy's going to have no choice but to say guilty. And then he's either going to spend 25 years in jail, or if the Donbass, the Donetsk Republic decides to implement special military regime, he'll be put up against the wall and shot. But one way or the other, he's going to be held to account for crimes. There's a world of difference between that and that poor sergeant.
Right.
I'm saying that sergeant was in an impossible situation. He made the wrong choice. As a human being, he made the wrong choice. You never kill civilians.
Yep.
Unarmed civilians. That you accept the consequences of your failure as a soldier, of being that, but legally speaking, he was protecting himself from potential compromise, and he made a decision that could be argued in the context of military necessity. And the proportionality is kill one civilian, save two soldiers. I'm just saying that there was a defense that could be made that wasn't made because this was done in a Ukrainian court. And this was a very politicized trial.
Scott, let me just pivot quickly, because I think this is very much related to what you just said, and I'm curious to have your opinion. There was a very famous Al Jazeera journalist that was killed last week. Her name is Shireen Abu Akleh. She's a Palestinian Christian. She's also an American citizen.
American citizen, yeah.
Yeah, right. And now the Israelis are saying they won't investigate, they won't launch a criminal investigation for her killing, because I think the quote was, an investigation that treats Israeli soldiers as suspects will lead to opposition within Israeli society. Now, given the legalities here, the West Bank, where in Jenin, where this happened, this is occupied by Israel. That's recognized by the UN worldwide. They're an occupying force. And, she was a journalist. She's clearly marked press. I don't understand this, how they can just assume that the notion of launching an investigation is opposed by Israeli society. What does that even mean?
Well, what's curious is we had a guy named, I think it was Jamal Khashoggi, who wasn't an American citizen, but he wrote for an American outlet, the Washington Post, and he wandered into a Saudi consulate in Istanbul and was murdered, dismembered, his body made to disappear. And we, the United States, rightfully expressed outrage. And we sought to hold the Saudi government accountable for the longest time. I think gradually we're slipping away. We tend to have short memories that are driven more by political necessity than justice in this case. But here we have an American citizen doing her job as a member of the media, murdered by the Israeli military, murdered. There's no justification for shooting her. She wasn't on the front line. She was clearly marked as press. There was no active combat situation. She was murdered, singled out and murdered. It's not just that the American government is silent. Every single mainstream journalist in the world is silent.
Yep.
I mean, this is what's stunning, because I can tell you right now, if Anderson Cooper of CNN went to Ukraine and put on his little press hat and his press vest and all this, and the Russians hit him with a caliber. And he's sitting there broadcasting live, and the caliber comes in and boom, kills him. Man, every journalist in the world will be saying, yep, "Oh my God, the murder of an American, the murder of journalism. This is war against freedom of press." And it would never end.
Yeah, rightfully so.
Rightfully so, of course. I'm not saying it should happen. I'm saying
yep,
they would scream about it. And the reason why I use Anderson Cooper is he's a big name here in the United States. Big name. She's a huge name in the Middle East.
Yep.
This is not some, wannabe journalist. This isn't some, freelance person. This is a serious journalist who's been around, who's established, who is well known, famous, etc. And she's an American citizen. And there's silence, absolute silence. The hypocrisy is just stunning. And the fact that Israel is allowed to get away with this. It never ceases to amaze me how much the United States is willing to debase itself when confronted by Israeli crimes against Americans. I mean, this goes back to the USS Liberty.
Yep.
Come on, man. They attacked our ship. They killed our sailors, and we let them get away with it. And we let them get away with repeated crimes. And this is just the latest. Rachel Corrie, letting her be run over by a bulldozer, and we do nothing. No, it is time. And I say this as somebody who used to be very close to Israel and to the Israeli government and to Israeli intelligence, Israeli soldiers. We had a common cause in hunting down Iraq's weapons of mass destruction. And I recognize the threat potential of those weapons to Israel and the necessity for Israel to see that these weapons were destroyed. But that doesn't mean that you turn a blind eye to mistakes. I considered myself to be a friend of Israel, but friends don't let friends drive drunk. And Israel right now is a raging alcoholic behind the wheel of a car, heading towards a crowd of children on school break. You got to stop them. You got to stop them. And the only nation that can stop them is the United States, and we're doing nothing. They murdered an American citizen. I mean, Russia arrested an American for beating up a cop, and we scream bloody murder. The Israelis murder an American citizen, a well-known journalist, clearly marked as a journalist doing her job, and we're silent. It's just stunning.
Yeah, you're talking about Trevor Reed. He was exchanged with Yaroshenko. I interviewed Yaroshenko. But yeah, I mean, with Shireen, I mean, it goes without saying, you and me have very, very different opinions about Israel. But you know, the fact that they can get away with this, you know, today Benny Gantz is the Israeli defense minister, is meeting with the U.S. military officials in Washington. They don't even raise this issue with them. They don't even raise this issue that you killed one of our citizens. I mean, for me, this is not unique. This is a continuation of Israeli occupation, Israeli policy.
Let me just say one thing here as clarification. I was a friend of Israel when I worked with Israel from 1994 to 1998. But the Israel that exists today is not the Israel that I was friends with. I was friends with the Israel of Yitzhak Rabin. I was friends with the Israel that could consider peace with the Palestinians, that would consider talking with the Palestinians. I'm not the friend of a Benjamin Netanyahu Israel. I'm not the friends of a Benny Gantz Israel. I'm not the friend of the Israel that existed. I'm not saying that Israel was good back then. I'm saying that the Israel back then, at least the people I talked to, spoke of the Palestinians in a respectful manner, and they understood the necessity to live together in peace. The Israel that exists today, they don't even talk like that anymore. You're not allowed to talk like that anymore. And the abuse that's being heaped on the Palestinians is unforgivable. So I just wanted to make that clear, that it's not as like I'm sitting here singing praises of the state of Israel as the current configuration. And I don't know if Israel could ever go back, because while I was there in the 90s, something happened. They opened the door and they allowed 600,000 Russian Jews in, Ukrainian Jews in. Many of them weren't Jews. They were just people, criminals fleeing to Israel, having lied. That forever changed the dynamic, because you had a balance in Israel of the old Israelis that had been born there, had grown up with Palestinians, and recognized them as people who lived together, et cetera. And then you had you had your European Jews that came in after World War II, and but so there was always this struggle in a political struggle in Israel. But a balance had been reached. And a lot of that balance was reached by people who were exhausted by the fight, exhausted by the nonstop violence. When I was in Israel in the 1990s, every time I visited, there was a horrible terrorist attack, a bus blowing up, a cafe blowing up, something blowing up. And the Israelis were exhausted by it. And their opinion wasn't, we're blaming the Palestinians exclusively. Their opinion was, the situation that prompts these attacks is intolerable. We have to change the situation. But when you brought in this wave of immigrants, they came in hating the Palestinians, hating Muslims. There was no concept of tolerance. And I think when you inject basically 10% of a new electorate into the Israeli demographic, that you skew Israel and you changed Israel permanently. And I think today, the Israel of today is a nation that is going to have a hard time justifying its continued existence, because it doesn't exist for anything other than the benefit of Israeli Jews. And that's an intolerable situation when you have millions of Palestinians who are as deserving of a homeland as any Israeli.
I get what you're saying, Scott. The demographics certainly changed, but my cousin, his grandfather came to Syria in the late 1940s as a refugee. So I mean, for Palestinians since 1948, since the beginning, it hasn't been tolerant. So I mean,
I know. I'm not trying to defend anything. I'm just saying that that the situation, the Israel that I dealt with in the 1990s is not the Israel of today.
Yeah, I mean, I think for Syria since 1967 being occupied, and before that carved up by the UK, carved up by France, and Israel being promised in 1917, for Syrians, for Palestinians, for Lebanese, Israel since the very beginning, no matter what nature it takes place, it's just a continuation of colonialism. So it's always going to be that way. But at the same time, I understand a little bit what you're saying, that the makeup inside of it politically has become maybe even hardcore. But again, I mean, it depends what threshold you look at it from. Because for Arabs, it's always been
come
bad.
at it from an American perspective. I don't have the shared history that you do. I don't have, the deep-seated, defiable resentment you do. Of course not. I'm an outsider looking in. Anyways, I just wanted to, set the record straight on.
Yeah, of course. I was actually going to ask you about that, because the Israelis, whose side are they on right now? You saw Lavrov's comments about Zelensky. The Israelis don't want to give the Iron Dome, which I don't know why the Ukrainians want that anyway. What do you think the Israeli policy is going to be now? Because you said it yourself, there's so many Russian Jews, Ukrainian Jews. They have ties to both countries. So would you say it's similar to Turkey, where they have to walk a fine line between who they take sides with?
Well, I think that of course, Israel, any politician has to walk a fine line in a situation as complicated as Israel's domestic politics. I mean, it's crazy. But Israel also has to understand that Russia plays a very important role in guaranteeing Israel's security, especially in regards to Syria, and that if Israel goes too far in supporting Ukraine, that Russia can make life very, very difficult for it. There's already an indication that Russia may have green-lighted Syria using the S-300 system to actively target Israeli aircraft. That would be a game changer. And I think that's Russia sending a signal to Israel that there are consequences for your actions, and Israel has to find a balance, and they're struggling to find the balance, because we're dealing with a situation. Israel, the government is collapsing. There's going to be new elections, I think, and which means politicians, everything a politician does, every move a politician makes is going to be subjected to that much more scrutiny. So everything is politicized right now, and it's just a tough situation for an Israeli politician.
Yeah, it's.
I know you don't have too much sympathy for him, but
No. I'm actually. I just think it's very interesting, because I always knew they have lots of Ukrainian Jews and Russian Jews, so they have ties to both countries. What the hell do they do? That's a very interesting one. Scott, I wanted to just see if there's anything I forgot to ask you about. I know I've racked your brain now for quite a bit, but yeah, the last thing, Russia cut off electricity, I think it was, to Finland, and they cut gas to Poland and Bulgaria. I know this is pivoting back to what we said with the gas, but I asked this sort of rhetorically. Do you think the Europeans are, just why are they shooting themselves in the foot? Is it because they have a disconnect between themselves and their people? Some might argue this is a class issue, that they're not affected by higher prices and all this, or they're trying to be as subservient as possible to the Americans. What is the factor for the Europeans? Why are they on board with everything that America is telling them to do, or NATO?
Well, you need to. When I say you need, look, it's late and my brain's not working, so I don't want to come off as sounding, you need to listen to me because not at all. Collectively, we need to, put things into a context. Before we evaluate the present, we have to understand the context. And the context of NATO is that it is a failed and failing alliance. What happened in Afghanistan was just the most recent of blows to the integrity of NATO. What does NATO stand for? And NATO is seeking to redefine itself now through the Ukrainian conflict. But that's I think that can only be accomplished in the short term, not the long term. Because anytime you take a long, hard look at what Russia's doing in Ukraine, you realize that one of the primary reasons why there's a war in Ukraine is because of irresponsible NATO expansion, and NATO can't justify why it's expanding, for what purpose other than to expand. So you have that. So you have NATO, which is already defensive, And so the leaders of the NATO countries are desperate to find relevance and legitimacy for the NATO mission post-Afghanistan, and Ukraine is that. So they're leaning forward on that without giving due regard to the consequences of their actions. The other thing is Brexit and the fragility of the European Union. Right now Europe's going through a major internal political wrestling match between, on the future of the euro and in the euro economy. You have France, which is encouraging more liberal spending, and you have Germany, which is traditional banking conservatism. And so there's this wrestling match within Europe. And even before the conflict in Russia, in Ukraine, you have people like Macron speaking of the need for a more Eurocentric approach to defense that's less reliant on the United States. But then you have Poland and the Baltics and the Balkans to a lesser extent, realizing that without the United States, they lose all of their relevance, that the only leverage they have in Europe is because they are so pro-American, they allow themselves to be used as an extension of American foreign policy. So you have all these internal struggles taking place for relevance for Europe and for NATO. And the Ukrainian conflict is seen by these political leaders as a chance to breathe new life into the NATO alliance and into the European Union as an entity. And that's why I think they went ahead with this rush to supporting sanctions without actually thinking what the consequences would be. But now they're dealing with the reality of their actions. And there's a huge disconnect, I believe, between the people and the politicians. And the more this economic crisis unfolds, the greater this gulf between the governed and the governing is going to be. And I think there will be tremendous consequences for the various democratically elected leaderships of Europe. I'd love to take a snapshot right now of all the leaders, and then in a year's time, this time next year, let's take a snapshot of who's in power, and see how much change there's been. Because this coming winter is going to be a very hard winter for Europe, very hard winter. And the thing about parliamentarian government is that it's not held to, like in the United States, the only way we can get rid of a president is either wait for a next election or impeach him. But a parliament can have a vote of no confidence at any time. A prime minister can be kicked out of office tomorrow. And so I'd like to see how many votes of no confidence are going to take place in the coming winter, because I don't think it's going to be a consequence-free political season for the European leaders who have got Europe into such a bind.
Yeah, I was just talking about this earlier with a friend, and I don't think it's going to be pretty. There's going to be a lot of social unrest, and it's very unfortunate. But that's what that's how it's looking. And I keep saying the West is shooting itself in the foot, but that doesn't mean it's a funny thing or something that's to be just perceived as comedy. It's actually a lot of people are going to suffer from this, and it's
watching a buffoon commit suicide is never a pleasant thing.
Yeah, right. That's a good way of putting it. Scott, before I let you go, what's the situation right now with your social media? Are you still banned on Twitter? And I mean, what happened?
I'm permanently banned on Twitter. It's interesting. I've submitted a new appeal, just reminding them of the stupidity of their position, just to go on record with it. But there's been no response. What are my options? To make this a freedom of speech fight and take them to the courts and sue them. That's noble, but the chances of victory are slim to none, and really is the juice worth the squeeze. This is just Twitter we're talking about. It's I'm not minimizing it. In this game that we're playing of alternative media, and I don't mean a game in a denigrating way. We're involved in a process that I believe strongly in, because it empowers people to get information and gain access to information and ideas outside of the prison of mainstream media. So, we're involved in something I think that's very important. So I don't want to trivialize the role that Twitter plays. Twitter is very important. I was heavily engaged in Twitter. I tweeted frequently, and some of my tweets had a lot of impact. And I was sort of tickled by that. But I also don't want to empower Twitter more than it needs to be. I mean, there are some limitations to the platform, and some of those limitations come from the failure of imagination on the part of their leadership to permit genuine free expression. The danger of giving Twitter too much credence today is that you're empowering censorship. The more people that engage in Twitter under the pretense that they're engaged in a free-willing debate discussion, that creates an artificial reality that's divorced from what's really going on, which is Twitter is severely limiting the free expression of fact-based ideas. And so I don't want to give Twitter too much credence. I think what you're doing is invaluable, and it's outside of Twitter. I know you tweet, but you're doing this. Other people do, YouTube-based platforms or other things, and it's just very important. So I think I'd rather spend my time engaged constructively with you and others than jousting at windmills, trying to score some feel-good political point over Twitter regarding censorship. It's a tough one, because I believe in freedom of speech, but sometimes I think the best way to defend yourself from about freedom of speech is to engage in free speech, and that's what we're doing tonight. So this is my response to Twitter. Stick it in your ear. I'm here with Richard Medhurst.
Yeah, it's a pleasure always to have you, Scott. I genuinely mean that. And where can people follow you now? Because I've seen you doing some new videos we can see your desk, and it looks very nice. And I felt like I was watching an amazing history channel, which is usually the case when you come on. So do you have a YouTube now or something, or where can people follow you?
YouTube. I'm not that smart. I'm not as clever as you are. So I use Telegram. So I put some stuff on Telegram. I have a Facebook page that was primarily set up for inter-family communications, but I post some stuff on that. But I think the major thing that I'm doing right now is, rather than trying to weaponize myself, I'm a tool that can be used by others who have established social media presences. I think I get more bang for the buck in terms of freedom of speech and getting ideas out by helping others facilitate the infrastructure they've put in place, such as you. You have this wonderful program, this podcast, this network. So rather than trying to create a competition to you, I'm just a tool that can be used by you and used by others as they see fit. And the beauty of that is, I'm under no pressure to sustain anything. All I have to do is sit back, and if somebody wants to talk to me, I have to decide whether I want to talk to them. And if things cool down, I get to play a lot of golf or go play with my dogs or something. I don't have to worry about sustaining a YouTube presence or anything like that.
That's a really good point. Honestly, that's a really good point. But seriously, Scott, you're very humble, and I, not just myself, but everybody who's watching, they are also very appreciative. I think we've got about 10,000 people watching, which is amazing. So again, those of you who have not hit the like button, please like the video. It helps YouTube recommend the video. It helps the channel and to spread the word. Is this your Telegram, Scott? I'm putting it up on the screen. It's Scott Ritter. Okay, that's it. Me. So that's a hell of a following that you've got there on Telegram. So that's great. That's really great. I'm going to put the link right now.
I didn't realize it was that big. Okay.
There, the link is in the chat right now. I just pasted it. And you said there's a Facebook as well. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, it's I think I just use my name. It's Scott Ritter, Facebook.
Okay.
It's a ridiculous picture of me, and I'm sitting in the back of a helicopter in Iraq with a Canadian getting ready to do an airborne inspection.
Okay. I'll find it and put it in the description. Scott, again, thank you so much. It's always a pleasure for me to have you on, and I really mean that, and I hope to bring you on again soon. It's become sort of a regular thing, I feel, and that's good, and people love it. Is there anything else you want to?
I just want to say thank you for your work too. I mean, I don't like to say I follow you. It sounds like I'm stalking you, but I watch what you do, and I think what you're doing is invaluable. And please continue doing it, because it's very important. It exposes people to important points of view that otherwise would be silenced by the mainstream media. So thank you very much.
Thank you. That's very humbling coming from you, and I'm very grateful. Thank you, Scott. Everybody, Scott Ritter, former UN weapons inspector, Marine Corps intelligence officer, and expert military analyst. Again, it's a pleasure to have you on, Scott. I hope to see you again soon.
Don't forget all around good guy. Okay, have a good night.
All around good guy.
All around good guy.
Okay, take care, Scott.
Thank you. Okay.
Good night. Bye-bye.
Good night.